We really have a treat ahead of us today. We have Dr. Hedges, who I've dubbed as Orange County's Freud, and he's going to present the theory on the organizing level issues. And we've got Joyce Holgus, who's going to give us the clinical material and make it come alive. So it's really going to be a good day. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ronald Hers.
Thank you, Suzanne. The topic for the day, as you know, is working the organizing experience. I think a key idea for you to grasp about this is contact and withdrawal. The search for contact with the human who is the other, and the fear of that contact, which leads to withdrawal back into the withdrawn state. Think about the frightened animal that arrives on your doorstep hungry. You offer food, but they are afraid. So any of you who came to find out how to get organized from the title, forget it. This is something else. I heard Dr. Hedges and Dr. Holgus do a similar presentation a few months ago. I'm looking forward to hearing it again. They have been studying this organizing experience for years, and they have a great deal to offer us. Dr. Joyce Holgus is a clinical psychologist who practices intensive psychotherapy with adults in Placentia, California. She presented her case material at that time in a most thoughtful and sensitive manner. She appears to me to be a superb clinician espousing the highest ideals of intellectual and emotional honesty, a sense of comfort with not knowing, and the virtues of patience, kindness, and a genuine desire to be involved with the patient, in spite of the pain of it. To give of herself without any loss of her sense of self. In fact, her sense of self appeared to be enhanced by her courageous activities. So I know Dr. Holgus as a therapist. Dr. Hedges, on the other hand, I know as a supervisor and teacher. I can't think of a better way of introducing him than to tell you of my experience with him. I started working with him about 2 years ago because of a difficult case. No one else I consulted with offered much hope that this patient could truly be helped. I did not want to give up, but it was not easy for me to learn about this organizing state. It felt so far from my everyday experience. That's why I gave you the everyday experience of the frightened animal. In spite of my 15 years of practice, I felt very inexperienced and unprepared, like a young mother. And Dr. Hedges was like a good grandmother and a good grandfather as well, showing me how art and science can work together. His credentials are that he is the founding director of the Newport Psychoanalytic Institute, where he currently serves as a supervising and training psychoanalyst. He's director of the Listening Perspective Study Center, is in private practice in Orange. He holds a faculty appointment at UC Irvine Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry. He's the author of numerous papers dealing with the psychotherapeutic processes and clinical texts, listening perspectives in psychotherapy, and interpreting the countertransference. Dr. Hedges and Dr. Holgus.
Daryl began relating to his therapist, Susan, in a very unusual way. He had no words to express any of his feelings. He didn't have experiences like most of us have, but he could come and sit quietly, and a picture would form. So for some months, they related in pictures. He would come in, not knowing what to tell her, and he felt very frustrated. He said, "I don't know what to say." After a period of time, she got very comfortable with it. She said the atmosphere was like going into a room of people meditating, a lot of strange energy that you didn't know. You knew something very important was happening, but you didn't know what it was. And so, in time, she got used to the images. She described him, she's a bioenergetic therapist, and she describes him as having a schizoid body type. A schizoid body type is elongated with the energy, life energy is not in the limbs, not in the feet, not in the hands. The energy remains more or less in the center of the body, moving towards the head, so that the head is almost isolated from the body. She, being a bioenergetic therapist, wanted to begin making contact with him, but knew that it would be a cautious thing that she must do. So with his permission, she gradually began to touch his forehead ever so lightly and ask him to report his experience. Two things. A part of me, he says, feels good, and I want to stay here forever. I never want to leave. Another part of me says it's not real. I don't feel your touch. It's not happening. He was 45 years old, had been married for 20 years. The marriage was childless. The major complaint that he had was that he found himself attracted to a woman where he worked, a woman in his office. This attraction was an interesting thing because he was a rather shy man. The attraction started with them talking and sharing books. They would pass books back and forth and begin to talk. He reported, "This is the first time I've ever felt understood in my life." He felt attracted to the woman. He felt excited. He looked forward to seeing her. He felt understood. And then the horrible anxiety began. He became terrified. And then he found himself doing everything that he could to avoid her. He reported to therapy, asking the therapist to exorcise the attraction. He did not want to be attracted to this woman. In his marriage of 20 years, he had managed to stabilize the contact problem. That is, he and his wife very early on made very little contact. They interacted very little. There was no sexual relationship at all. And he maintained that he stayed out of duty. The first image that he produced that was very interesting and impelling, he said, "It's like a memory, but it's not a memory. It's like me, but it's not me. There's a little boy in a backyard, and he's working very hard with clay, dirt, clay that he's taken out, and he's molding something, he's sculpting something, and he's working very intense, and he's getting more and more excited until it's perfect. It's a knight. He's made a knight. And he takes it in his hands, starting in the house, to take it to his mother. And he falls, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. And at that point in the session, the man breaks into sobs. He said, "I could never take anything to her. She was not available. She was never there for me." The next image was he was camping, and he went for an evening walk in the desert. The sky was sepia red, blood red. The horizon was long, and he comes upon some bones, animal bones, in the desert. And he looks at the bones, and he begins sobbing. And in the session he sobs. He says, "I cry for all of the creatures that have crawled the earth that no one has ever known about, that no one has ever loved." And he cried again with his therapist. Once he pictured himself as an infant, a young infant, a baby, and as he began to see himself as a baby, the head began to expand like a balloon, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally detached itself from the head, from the body, and went off into the sky. Very ugly, he says, very ugly. We couldn't ask for a nicer picture of the schizoid body type, could we? He says, "I see myself a car beside a freeway. All of the other cars are moving. They're going back and forth. They have motors. They know how to run. My car looks all right from the outside. It looks the same as all the others. But there's no motor in it. It doesn't know how to run." So then the exchanges began. As you might expect, since this was a referring complaint, he began to have exchanges with his girlfriend. So he and the therapist began exchanging little things. First, he brought tortilla flats. He said, he wanted her to read it, "I love this place. I want to live here forever." In return, she brought Kafka's Metamorphosis. This is where you really live. Then he brought in music, Harry Chapin's music. There were several cuts that had a lot of special meaning to him. The first cut, The Sniper. You've probably heard it. I can't sing it for you, I'm sorry. The Sniper, of course, records the event at the University of Texas, the man in the tower that shot 37 people. And so the music goes on with the shots in the background. Mother, I wanted you to love me. I wanted you to nurse me. I wanted you to be there. Mother, I cannot forgive you for your blindness. Mother, I hate you. Until the shots subside with all the deaths. He says it's about being alive. If I touch you, I know that I'm alive. If you touch me, I know that I'm alive. In this case, if I kill you and you kill me, then I know that I've been alive. The next cut he liked from Harry Chapin was called Burning Herself. The therapist wasn't quite sure exactly who was being burned. Was this his mother? Was this his wife? Was this his girlfriend? Was it the therapist? Of course, it was himself. He explains that he burns himself with cigarettes, and the reason is that there is so much pain on the inside, if he can feel the pain on the outside, he knows that he's alive. He burned all things in his office that were personal. Photographs, fountain pens, anything that bore any resemblance to him as a human being. He says, there's nothing personal inside, there shouldn't be anything personal outside. She was, of course, worried about suicide, but it seemed as though he was not suicidal, but more the kind of person who would wither and die, perhaps cancer, perhaps some other kind of fatal disease, because there was no will to live. So then came the day, he came in a little depressed one day, and he says, I had a dream within a dream. In the second level of the dream, he says, I was at work, and we were producing an opera. One of my colleagues was trying to introduce me to her sister. I kept trying to avoid them. I went everywhere I could trying to avoid them. I felt like I was a fish in one of those nets. You know, the spiral nets, the traps where you go, and I was backing further and further away so that I could never get out. And finally she trapped me and she cornered me, and she introduced me to her sister, Amelia. I woke up terrified to the first level of the dream. At the first level of the dream, I heard a harsh woman's voice calling me. I didn't know what to do. I thought it's my mother's voice. Then I thought, no, it's my wife with my mother's voice. And I was once again afraid and woke up. When I heard the dream, I immediately thought of Amelia. He's made contact with a human being, who I'm a sister. And when we take apart the word Amelia, we think of the Latin prefix a, meaning without. When he meets her, he's without a me. When the contact is there, there's no me. He associated to opera. Opera's the most useless thing in the world. And if all he had to do when he went to work was to produce an opera, life would indeed be meaningless. At that point, he said, today at work was particularly meaningless. I was feeling particularly useless, and I was feeling depressed about it, and I left a little bit early. I went to a restaurant to have dinner before I came to my session. And on the curb, there's a homeless person sitting on his bedroll, asking for change. I said to him, would you like to have dinner with me? He says, no, thanks. I've had breakfast. I ask again, would you like to have dinner with me? No, thanks. I've had breakfast. At this point, he begins to cry. Perhaps he knew something. Perhaps he knows the meaning of life. I'm sorry he didn't eat with me. I could have learned something from him. And he's sobbing deep sobs with his therapist. At that point in the session, The therapist reports the session becomes confused and choppy. He can't focus. He's worried that he doesn't have enough to give her. He doesn't know how to use his time. He begins to become tense. His body becomes tense all over, and he doesn't know what to say. All attempts on her part to soothe him fail. Suddenly the therapist pictures an infant, a very tense baby, that everybody's doing whatever they can to try to soothe the baby, and nothing works. She tells them about her image, that it's as though that was what she was thinking. It's as though he's an infant that's tense, and nobody can do anything to make him feel better. She says, he's not looking at my eyes. I tell him I would enjoy having contact with you, with our eyes. I feel like I'm trying to entice you to look at me. He knows that she wants contact. He knows that she's a human being asking for human contact from him. He says he's very afraid. He would rather think of her as a robot, as an automaton. I know you have people coming to your consulting rooms every day. When you come here to this hospital and other hospitals, you have people as well that are not unlike Daryl. And you can identify with the helplessness that Susan had to feel in this particular situation. When a person experiences themselves as a shattered statue, as a knight in shining armor, trying to take himself to mother, but then at that point, just at the point of contact, he falls apart. Just at the point when he's ready to meet a woman, he falls apart. When he experiences himself as cartoon characters, as a head like a balloon floating away, as a motor car beside a freeway, all of these non-human images, how can human touch reach someone who doesn't at all feel human? And I think that's the question we're going to try to deal with today. The people that we're talking about, they present a great number of different kinds of so-called symptoms, all the way from frank schizophrenia and the manic depressive disorders, schizoid states, autistic states, multiple personalities. Sometimes when we have people that are otherwise better developed, but they fall into states, it could be the eating disorders, the addictions, the character disorders, and then we have to think about ourselves. We all once had a mother that didn't meet us in certain ways. And so the organizing experience is an experience that we all know about. Madness is something that's been known throughout all times and all cultures, but we've thought about madness in very different ways. So today we're going to try to think of yet a different way. As you know, in the old days, mad people were burned at the stake, called witches, banished, or allowed to live quietly in some back corner of the barn or the farm. In the 19th century, a more humanistic movement started asylums, started mental hospitals, mental illness. Within our lifetime, the phenothiazines, hospitals. And yet, as we find this movement going closer and closer to seeing these strange people that have been labeled mad, more like ourselves, we become more puzzled. And so today we're going to talk about how madness is universal, how we get in contact with the madness in ourselves, and how we can begin to imagine ways of reaching out and providing human contact to people who otherwise have not been able to utilize it. The charts that I have up here today you have in your handout, so you can kind of follow along. I want to do just a quick overview for the day so you have some thought about what's happening, where we're going. The first thing you've already heard me say, we'll be taking the position that the organizing experience is a universal experience. The second one, terror of human contact, is central. We'll be talking about the frightening aspect of meeting another person and feeling truly connected. Then we'll be talking about psychotic transference or organizing transference. The psychotic or organizing transference is going to be to the overstimulating mother or the understimulating mother. And today we're going to be talking a lot about mothers, and I have a favorite term, the psychotic mother. And I want to be very clear at the outset, we're not talking about the real mother. Okay? We don't know what the real mother is like. There are many times we have the sense that the real mother was basically a good mother. But because of some match or some difficulty in the mother-child relationship, the child was not able to utilize the mothering. Perhaps she was disturbed, regressed, depressed? Perhaps not. So the psychotic mother we're going to be talking about is an experience of a mother that does not know how to meet me when I need to be met, so that I close off a channel that would otherwise remain open. A frightening experience we'll be talking about. So that we'll be looking at the transference to that psychotic mother. We'll be then also looking at resistance, and the resistance in this kind of work is to human contact. Interpretation, we'll be taking a somewhat radical position today. I think we'll be able to justify it. We feel that the final interpretive event at this level is going to be accompanied by some form of human touch. That we think of the marvelous picture on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the enlivenment of Adam. We see God in all of his chariot. His arm is around his woman, his hand on the boy. The whole mass of teeming humanity is on his chariot. When we look at the chariot as an image, it's a brain stem, a human brain and a brain stem, and the hand of God reaching out to enliven a human soul. And as the day goes forward, we will be able to show you, we feel, that with these people, that kind of human contact, the tremendous motivation to reach out and to bring another person into human life. Countertransference, we'll spend a lot of time on that one this afternoon, okay? Briefly, I'll summarize, just so you know where we're going. We're going to talk about 4 kinds of countertransference. The first kind we know very well. It's a denial of the other person's humanity. The person is untreatable. They're too sick, they're too crazy, they're psychotic. There's no way of relating to the person. The second form of countertransference has to do with the fear, the therapist's fear of reaching out and connecting, because when the connection is made, tremendous instinctual energy, sex, aggression, love, is released and directed at the person of the therapist. It's strong, it's intense, it's raw, and it's full of energy, and it's frightening to the therapist to go after that and to draw it towards themselves. So we're afraid of that. The third form of countertransference, I'm going to say, is the countertransference to our psychotic mothers. As infants, we all reached out in various ways and found painful experiences there, regardless of how good our mother was overall. There were ways in which we had needs, we had experiences, and we wanted to reach out, and our mother wasn't there for us, and we withdrew. And the message is somehow that gets laid almost at a neurological level is, never go there again. And we know altogether too well that many of our creative potentials are blocked, are stopped, because we're afraid to reach out. Something prevents us from reaching out. And so, when we reach out to someone who is not there, to one of the people we're talking about in our consulting rooms, and they continue to turn away and to break off the contact, what it stirs up in us is our deepest psychotic anxieties of when we are once reached out in need, in affection, in love, and we're not met. And so our own psychosis begins to get stirred up as well, and we get thrown into our own organizing experiences in which there's no compass, no orientation, in which our own sense of instincts are alive and disoriented, and so it's rather frightening for us. And the last kind of countertransference, I'll spend a little more time with it this afternoon. This kind of countertransference took me by surprise. As I began coaching therapists in this difficult work, we began getting into the contact mode, and that'll be the central theme for today, to where the therapist begins to find ways of establishing contact. The client begins to have some sense of how crucial the contact is and begins cooperating in it. And after a while, the two are very excited because they're learning how their own private ways of making contact. The client is bringing in information from the outside world and is making this contact, and the therapist then comes to me and says, I'm starting to blank out. I'm dozing. I'm falling asleep. I'm pulling back. Just when we're really doing what we need to be doing, I don't understand it. I think it's empathy. You've seen this a million times in couples you've worked with, where you find people doing strange things and you begin to realize they're doing strange things for each other. We realize that the most terrifying thing to these people is human contact. And when we begin to stimulate it and get it flowing, they know that this is where they have to go, and they're excited and they're moving towards it. And I think our unconscious is aware it's too much, it's too soon, it's too overstimulating, it will be traumatic. And so I think the therapist unconscious begins to sort of quiet things down, begins to blot out. And of course, when the therapist is aware of that consciously, then there are other ways of doing it. There are other ways of slowing things down, of guarding the contact, of letting it going in slow doses that are manageable. The seventh point is all organizing states may be transformed. That is the position that Joyce and I have taken, based really on 10 years of experience, or 12 on both of our parts, coming from different angles. We've not seen people that are untreatable, in principle. No matter how sick, no matter how crazy, no matter what, we witnessed many such people being brought into states of transformation. Now, in practice, we find there's some problems. The quickest example I can give you is someone whose psychotic transferences take, say, a homicidal or destructive or, severely dangerous form. Well, we certainly can't see these people in our outpatient offices. We're not safe. We may not even be able to see them safely in an ordinary hospital setting. Harold Searles reports some cases where he actually has to have 2 armed guards outside the door while he's seeing the patient with the instruction that the minute there's a bit of noise, open the door and come in and rescue me. Okay? But that doesn't mean these people are untreatable. What it may mean is we don't know how to connect. It may mean we don't know how to treat them. And it may mean that the resource required for the treatment of this particular person is so great that it's not available. So I think the distinction that we have come to make is, in principle, we believe that all human souls can be enlivened. In practice, the problem is a practical one, and our field, our knowledge, our social resources are not mobilized, so there's a great many people at the present time that we may not be able to provide treatment for. And the last point I'd like to make about the overview of today is that you'll find that we're going to be taking a very different treatment approach, say, from the classical psychoanalytic approach. As you know, classical psychoanalysis was invented by Freud and is still supported within orthodox psychoanalysis for the treatment of neurosis. In the last 2 decades, we've watched the treatment expand and a lot of other kind of techniques introduced, and we'll talk about some of those today. But the treatment approach that we'll be suggesting today is radically different from what has been traditional. In the traditional situation, Freud said, the basic rule, come into my room, lay down on my couch, and say what comes to mind. Let it all hang out. Tell me what your thoughts are. It doesn't matter how bad they are, how sexual, how seductive, how mean, how aggressive, how hostile. Tell me what they are. The free association method. Now, free association, then, has also been called the impossible rule. You're supposed to free associate, but no one can. So we start talking, blah, 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 and suddenly there's a glitch. And you feel something in your stomach. Suddenly the words left you. Suddenly you think of something else. We find that we cannot free associate. But the purpose for free association as a basic rule is it sets a backdrop. Because what we're interested in is not free association, but we're interested in the glitches. Now, granted, by the time someone has been on an endless couch 3 or 4 or 5 days a week for 5 years, they're a little better at free associating than they were at the beginning. But free association is still constantly interfered with in a variety of ways by the unconscious. No one can ever fully free associate. But the rule of free association, or the idea of free association, has served many years as the backdrop against which conflict can be seen. So it's a device for perception. Now, at this lowest level of mental development, we know these people do not have words. We know that we're talking about experiences that happened in utero and in the first 3 or 4 months of life. That'll be the focus today. 4 months plus or minus birth. So we're not going to be able to expect words to convey it. The example I gave you, he could come up with a picture, and then he could describe the picture, but there were no words. He didn't even know what feelings were. So you ask a person what they feel, and why are you asking that? Who is this question for? It's not for me, doctor. Right? At the level of organizing, we feel that the idea, the notion of sustained contact as what we're shooting for, is the backdrop analogous to free association. Now, as the day goes on, you'll have more of a sense of contact, but I think we're all aware when we're in a room with someone and they're talking, and most of these people come in and bring us all sorts of vivid material, there's only an occasional moment in which for a second our eyes may meet or something happens and we know that there are two human beings in that room in contact at that moment. Now, what we're trying to do then in this form of therapy is to systematically increase the sense of human contact. So the idea of increasing and sustaining human contact as a backdrop then lets us evaluate all of the deviations from that, all of the ways in which contact cannot be sustained. So we have a very exciting day for you, a lot of material. It's going to be long. So let me now introduce to you Joyce Holgus.
In the smoggy days of summer 1980, I began a journey with a then mid-20, single, intelligent young woman, whom throughout the day we shall call Mary. Mary had her master's degree. She was a health professional. She had been released from an apprenticeship because, in essence, she was not able to apply in the laboratory setting of her profession the knowledge which she had been able to memorize so as to be a 4.0 student. Mary came to me devastated. We began the unanticipated lengthy journey by dealing with her sense of failure, rejection, and loss. I began quite empathically. It was not long, however, until as data emerged about the course of her 5 years of therapy in adolescence, from which she was very abruptly terminated, that is, in one session, and referred to a psychiatrist whom she saw only briefly because she said, "He did not talk. I could not relate to him." And as data emerged about the extensive incestual experience of childhood, and as data emerged about the intentional refusal at birth by mother to bond with Mary, I began to get a glimpse of a very different world in which Mary really lived. There were 7 hospitalizations in 1983 and 84, and there have been 2 since that time. The following note was placed on the windshield of my car at the office, and a letter was sent. You have a copy in your packet, page 8, of the note that was left on my windshield. You will notice that there is very little punctuation. It is a simple expression of her inner experience. The birds are dying and so am I. The stones are broken and my world shattered. Bob asked me to leave. My mother, my problems are wearing thin, too thin to die. I tried to call you, their guts are splattered. I have an intense death wish. Suicide, what's the point in the birds? Metro, metro, the birds are coming, and the stones rolled and cried out, suicide, 159. The sky is black, the rain frozen in air, the birds are crying for love, their feathers broken spirit is dead, the voices say, please DYE, and then DIE. Please, the stones are sand by now, rolling in blood. I tried to put it back together, and they ate it. Death is in the air, a heavy gloom they put in the grave. I stumbled down and fell in, where are you? I'm alone, so alone. It's dark, and I can't cry for the birds. They dead and gone forever. I wish I were a bird, could speak like a bird 3 times. Burn, I choke, goodbye. Me, appropriately in a box. That's the note that I got. about 6 years ago, after I had worked with her for a while, and like I said, that inner world unfolded after several years, and I began to get glimpses of the deep devastation that had happened for her as a result of mother not bonding. She had consistently an image of a very sterile nursery, of her laying without a blanket, without any mobiles, without any stuffed animals, laying very quietly on just a sheet, the room absolutely sterile, nothing on the walls, no music, nothing stimulating, and an image of a door in that nursery. And she only saw mother's back as mother left the room and never turned around to see who it was she was leaving. Then I received, sometime after that, this letter in the mail. It was interesting. Her return address was put on upside down, as was the stamp, and on the back of the envelope it said, "The spirits are rejoicing like vultures." And the spirits and the vultures were a theme for a very long time, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on this afternoon. But I will read to you the letter I received. I had gone to a professional seminar 4 days. She did have a transitional object. I did tell her where I was going. I did tell her when I would return, but I did not tell her the time that I was leaving. And obviously, after we had met, that became very important to her being able to hold on to any kind of contact with me. And she said, now you'll notice she has developed a little bit just because of how she's writing this letter. You can see it. I am feeling extremely fragile. I might break. I threw some bread out the window and the birds pecked apart my body and devoured it. I don't know which way to go. The H is only an illusion, a customation of sorts. It burns and burns. There is pain in both bars, an echo from the past. What difference does it make, you ask? It's one of pain versus closeness. A difference you don't want me to have anymore. Blue, blue, my heart is blue. Don't touch blue. The light grows dimly hue. There is a little girl standing at the window, crying. 127 years later, she still weeps. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity and wearisome under the sun. I know how there is no meaning in the golden hand that touches the water, and still she weeps. You hurt me very deeply, maliciously. You pushed me away. The bird's head is broken. You didn't want me to be connected to you. Therapist mother. The difference is pain and anxiety, but I won't look at the blue anymore. You were saying, what difference does it make? What difference does my need make? Maybe none anymore. Murder in the city is not the game as murder in the country. It's by now, it's by way of right, but the sorrow still bleeds. I needed to know what time you were to leave. I needed to know, but what difference does it make? I feel shattered once again with you. I don't know if I can put it back together this time. These are horrible thoughts, fears, reality. Everything has gone wild. Voices in the night. My trust is deeply shaken. Question mark upside down, but what difference does it make? Signed, Humpty Dumpty. That was then. And now, another 7 years later, I share with you transcribed from my verbatim shorthand notes. I'm grateful that I learned shorthand many years ago, and I take almost all of my clinical notes in shorthand in front of the client. And I've transcribed verbatim a session with Mary. I chose April of this past year of '91 because it has so much content in it. She came in, and right now she is much enlivened. There are smiles, there's a lift in her walk. She even teases me. If I'm a couple minutes late, she'll tease and tell me how come I'm late. Didn't I know that I needed her? And we're able to do things that were absolutely unheard of 6 years ago. And she came in and she talked about a memory as a child in her bedroom. And then she said, this part did not really happen. I was peeling off squares of skin in a larger square of skin. And then she said, now this part did really happen. Mother and Dad came into my room and screamed at me. Get out of your room, they said in a hateful way. This was my safe place. I did not understand why. Why did they not want me in my own room? I was just sitting in there. Maybe I had done something bad and they did not want me in the house, but there is a really deep feeling that is connected with that. It is like they disowned me, like they hated me so much that they were taking away my right to be in my own room. That was like going into the core of me and saying, you do not belong here. We do not want you, rejecting the core of me. And I said, it is like there is no place where you could put your feet or place your body where you could feel you belonged. No square inch was yours. So you early learned to float in space as you would not light anywhere and feel that rejection. And she quickly perked up. She said, did you say square inch, and did you connect that with the skin? She pondered a bit and she said, that came to me immediately. And you know, peeling off the skin had no pain connected to it. I was already into myself to the degree that even my flesh I was not connected to, so I felt no pain. It was like I had detached myself from myself and went into this little core. I could not stay in my body. It was being molested all the time. That happened about 10 years. I think I would have died if I would have stayed in my body. It was like I had two selves. There was the self that had the body and voice and stuff, and then there was the self that was inside that steel ball. Not quite sure what I'm saying right now. She does a lot of reflecting now. She listens to herself and hears what she says, and then she goes back to try to understand it. There was the self that had the body and voice and stuff, and then there was the self that was inside that steel ball. I guess I'm trying to say there was an iron ball, because steel is shiny, and this was dark color. This is dark color, so I guess it is iron. The iron ball is smaller than the steel vault. The steel vault became permanent living quarters. We used to talk about that a lot, that she was encased in a steel vault. There was no seams, no windows, no doors. There was no door latch. There was absolutely no way for her to get out or anyone to get in, which of course represented the lack of being able to connect. I guess I detached myself, from my feelings, yet there was so much pain in the iron ball. It had no contact with the outside world. I could not allow it, or I could not have maintained any life or sanity. I remember trying to detach myself in whatever way I could. I would stare out of the room windows unless forced to stop. I would walk very softly, almost like I would put the ball of my foot down first, so I would be very quiet, because Dad would be very angry if he heard me or had sight of me. I realize now I am starting to walk differently. I'm putting my heel down, and I can actually hear my steps. Before, that would raise such intense anxiety if I could hear myself walk. And I said, and now there's walking and talking and laughing and teasing. And she laughed. It feels like being born, yet it is like entering a different world from what I was in. And I said, it is. It's the world of relatedness. And as I said it, I got tears. And I said, but they're tears of joy. And she said, yeah. I was going to say that. I want to hug you. And she gave me a hug. And she said, Mama, you hatched me. Mary threw up her arms and made a little yell, yay! And she laughed. And I said, I'm wondering how what is happening now is related to or affecting that disturbed world that we know about. And she pondered a little bit. And she said, it is a little scary, I'm watching myself in kindergarten, huddled in the corner of the playground, and I'm watching myself from the sandbox where all the other kids are playing, and it is like all the other kids do not see me. I can hear them, but either I am unreal, sort of like a ghost, or I projected myself in the sandbox. Yet I am an older person watching this little girl huddled in the corner. I can feel the pain, and she began to tear and cry. This has only happened in the past year. Up until the past year, she was not able to cry at all. And she went on to say, I just have to ask why. It is not right. It is not right for a little girl to go through that. She was there with that pain all alone, you know. No one saw her there. It is the first time I have been able to see her from a distance and feel her pain. I've always been her and feeling it, but not able to express it. Now is the first time I have been able to cry for that little one. It was not her fault. She did not do anything wrong. She was not bad, yet they put it on her. They kept telling her she was bad. She was wrong. She should not have been born. Besides, who are they to say? God is the one who will say who will be born. It was their problem that they did not know how to love and cherish a little one. But I took all that in, and it made me sick. I have been sick all my life because I believed it. And then there was a deep sigh. And she just shook her head back and forth, and a very long silence. And then she said, that was a powerful scene for me. I see myself kneeling down in the sand, still watching her. She does not know that I am there. I do not know how to contact her. I just felt pain for her, what she went through, but she does not know that I exist. And at this time, Mary's looking off in the distance. I don't know what to do. If I'm a ghost, how do I connect with her when the adult is just like a ghost? And I said something to the effect of, that process of connecting will need to be very gentle and soft and slow, a little movement at a time, so that she is not frightened or threatened. And she shook her head the whole time I was saying that. I feel very strange. The strangeness is that I suddenly exist as an adult, and the only thing inside of me is the pain I feel for the little girl. Nothing else is inside of me yet. So kind of feel, I don't know, I can't think of the right word. It is just sort of like I do not feel all the clutter that is inside the little girl. All I feel is just the pain for her, but nothing else is cluttering it inside. I feel separate from her. Feels better for me, but I'm not sure it is good that that little girl is cut off from me now. I talked about embracing that little girl in time. She said, I guess I do not want to embrace her. That is why I am distant. Now I am feeling that little girl, that I am bad and deserve to die. I do not sense that adult anymore. Will you sit with me? And I do sit with her, and Mary lay her head on my lap. I have a blanket in the room. She can do with that blanket what she wants. Sometimes she does not use it. Sometimes she puts it on my lap and lays her head then on the blanket on my lap. Sometimes she lays her head on my lap and she wants me to cover her, almost like an in utero kind of experience. But she didn't ask for the blanket at that moment. She said, I am feeling troubled. And that is often her expression when we get to that core infant. I am feeling troubled because I have become part of my little girl again. I want to let go of the pain. I want to let it explode and leave me alone. I feel like I want to scream it out rather than stifle it like I always had to do. I want to be with you. And she was quiet for a moment. Right now I'm feeling built up anger and pain that wants to lash out, wants to start fighting back. Then she took the pillow and she punched it for about 10 seconds. This is a new experience for her. I could not get her to extend her body in any way in the first several years. So to punch a pillow was really an expression of something within her. And she laughed. She says, you were right on today. You must have gotten sleep last night. She remained playful for a while, then reflected on having felt the pain of the child, and then feeling uncomfortable inside. She said, I think I got perspective tonight, and have let go of the pain a little bit. Right now I feel stronger. I feel freer. Then she made several muffled yells. I am a person. I am not afraid of my voice any longer. Yay! And she threw the pillow to the ceiling and she laughed and she said, I am a person, so there. And that was the end of that session. How did I get from that note on my windshield and the letter in the mail to this session? Well, believe me, I did not do it alone. I had not been trained about anything in reference to organizing experiences. Of course, I knew the word manic depressive and schizophrenic, but I really didn't have much training about what do you do with these people. I knew primarily what most people knew, and that was, you know, get them evaluated and get them on some medication. And even the psychiatrist who has seen Mary on occasion has implied to me that I'm expecting too much. That really it would be better if I were just supportive and she would stay stabilized on medication, and that I would continue to do that until, you know, I closed my practice or I moved somewhere, and, you know, that would be the end of being there for Mary. I must tell you, as a human being, I cannot do that. And I will not do that. I have a deep personal faith in God, which I'm not ashamed to share, and that has also encouraged me. I don't believe people are mistakes. And I said, God, if you exist, and you say faith can remove mountains, this is the test case, Mary. And I've had a deep commitment to her. I care about her. I have done things that I was not taught to do. I have touched. I've let her lay on my lap. I have shopped with her. I've gone with her to buy a transitional object. She knew a friend of mine. I invited her to a surprise birthday party for that friend. Now, I'm not doing that to socialize. I am doing it to be therapeutic. I am communicating a message in action that we cannot communicate in words alone. The client had reported in her intake session that she had previously seen 2 male therapists for several years. She went on to say, it is not inoperable cancer. It is exciting for me, although I feel a little decompensating. In my dream the other night, there were doors flying open. I think that was the disorganization. In the dream, I got frantic for a substitute mother to protect the puppy who was alive but underneath the dead mother, to protect it so it would not die. And there was a long pause. She said, I feel I was born today. I often hear that phrase when contact is made. But it is scary. What if we disconnect? I see that my husband is married to an infant. He is not getting too much emotionally. We continue working together, the pervasive and the pocket. We're going to continue by sharing more about the organizing experience.
Mother and Child with Teeth, I think, is a new version of the Madonna theme. It's interesting. It's painted by a friend of mine, Alan Kirk. The painting just came from inside his soul one day. He was adopted at birth and had a traumatic series of, well, he wasn't adopted. He went through a series of foster homes and was adopted later. He didn't know, but in retrospect, at the time that this emerged, his lover was in the last 2 weeks of dying of AIDS. And his lover didn't know it because he'd never been tested. And so it threw Alan back to this place, back to the organizing experience, back to the mother with teeth. And it strikes me as a rather an inspired moment of realizing that when we're in grief, the deepest part of our organizing selves reappears. In psychoanalysis over the years, we've there have been 3 different major models for how to think about ourselves. The first model Freud initiated and published in 1900 in the 7th chapter of The Interpretation of Dreams, and we'll talk a little more about that chapter later this afternoon. But in that particular model, Freud was interested in trying to formulate the idea of the unconscious, the idea that we now take for granted and work with. Philosophers had talked about an unconscious or a subconscious mind for a long time, but never so clearly and never in the same way that Freud had done. The idea of there being an unconscious, a preconscious, and a conscious mind was the first paradigm of psychoanalysis, and it's as though that still runs throughout our field, but it's not the dominant way that we think. The second paradigm for psychoanalytic thinking, psychotherapeutic thinking, Freud introduced in 1923, the so-called structural paradigm, whereupon he felt it was useful in working with people in a clinical setting to think about the function of the I, the agent, the I, unfortunately translated in English with the Latin word ego. In German, it's I. Who am I? Where did I come from? What am I doing? It's a very personal sense in German. And then the I, how does the I emerge out of the long historical evolutionary sense of the it, the life force, that which lives in us, that which lives us, that has been moving for many, many years, millions of years. The it moves forward, it lives us, and out of that, the sense of I emerges. And then finally, as the infant begins to relate to the social world, the sense of an over-I begins to become part of who I am. Over as in a bicameral legislature. So the superego is an I that is over, the agent I that also governs who I am. So that the second paradigm of psychoanalysis is based upon ego structure. Most of our psychotherapies today, in one way or another, reflect that basic set of thoughts. The basic sense of working with ego strength, whether we're working with an inner child or whatever our particular modality of working is, we're basically following Freud's second model of the mind. What's been evolving now in psychoanalysis since 1954, when Edith Jacobson put out her first paper, The Self and the Object World, is a third paradigm in psychoanalysis that I choose to call relatedness. Edith Jacobson was a classically trained psychoanalyst, but she was working with people that she called functionally depressed. Now, today we would speak of them as lower level people or borderline people. What she meant was in their overall functioning, the functioning was depressed. As she tried to work with Freud's two basic paradigms, the topographical paradigm looking at the unconscious aspects and the structural paradigm looking at the ego aspects, she found that neither of those two ways of thinking helped her with these lower level developmental aspects. She said, rather, what was useful to her was to listen to the material, watch the way in which she related to people, and that the way in which people represented themselves, in contrast to others or otherness, was more helpful to her than the previous paradigms. She followed up the same idea in a book 10 years later, The Self and the Object World, opening up the idea of a different way of thinking when we look at, let's say, pre-Oedipal, when we look at developmental constellations that occur in the first few years of life. After all, let's face it, the baby's first task is to sort out what's in the environment, to try to make the world work for me. I'm born into the world, and the first set of studies that I have to make is, who am I to whom and who else is here? So it makes perfect sense retrospectively, but often those things that make the most sense don't occur to us till later. But what perhaps Edith Jacobson contributed more than any other was the notion that the mind is structured according to our experiences of ourselves, in contrast to others. We have had a whole series of literature then over the past 2 decades. Heinz Kohut worked with the self, working about the self. Otto Kernberg, Margaret Mahler has worked up some developmental schemas on how self and other interact and how they merge and differentiate, so that most of modern psychoanalysis is dominated by this third paradigm, relatedness, in which, as we're in a clinical hour or with someone, we're trying to listen to how are they experiencing themselves and us. Now, surrounding this third paradigm, then, a whole series of other ideas have evolved. And the reason I want to take just a few minutes today to review those for you is because the topic for today of the organizing experience requires a totally different vantage point than any vantage points that have preceded in order to be able to do clear, clean, effective, and transformational work. so that this third paradigm and the way that it's evolving through the work of many different writers is very important. Thomas Kuhn, as you know, has shown us in all of the structured disciplines, from time to time a new idea comes along which organizes and structures all of the previous data, so that the third paradigm has it encompasses everything that's gone before, but it's adding new features. The first feature that I'd like to talk about is the movement then, or the shift from healing to consciousness raising. Now, for many years we've talked about abandoning the medical model. Lip service to abandoning the medical model doesn't quite do it. So long as we're talking doctor-patient, so long as we're talking cure, we're still involved in a thought system. In my books, I've shifted completely out of that. I talk about speaker and listener. The person who comes to express who I am, how I feel, what I'm doing, where I'm going, how I see you, and the person who's listening. The forecast on this is I have another book that's several years away yet. The working title is Psychoanalytic City, okay? And in that one, it'll be, the theme of that book is find a relationship partner, plan to meet regularly, and take turns listening and speaking, and watch how you develop. Now, we do this in all of our significant relations, but we seldom focus on it as an activity. So I think that thinking of getting away from well doctor, sick patient, into thinking we've got two human beings that are trying to grow, that are trying to expand, that the therapist's consciousness is expanding at the same rate as the client's consciousness, and so we need to do that. Now, some people have said, well, isn't this just haggling with words or overtones? And so we've gone to client. I think client is at least a little better than patient. I don't think it is. We've studied now too much, for example, sexist language. It's fine for somebody to apologize. I'm going to still stay in a third-person masculine because, after all, it's more convenient or it's easier. I don't have to circumlocute. We don't have a liberated person. We don't have someone that's aware of where we're going. Our language reflects the way that we think. So long as we're thinking about cure, alleviation of symptoms, doctors, patients, we're still involved in a medical model of thinking. We've not yet let ourselves think about two people relating for the purpose of raising their consciousness about each other. The second major shift here that marks this third paradigm is the shift from scientific objectivity to systematic subjectivity. When Freud wrote the 19th century model of science, it was really developed by Newton in the 17th century, was the main language that he had to work with. It was Freud's dream to make a science of the mind. So when Freud began formulating, he tried to put everything in terms of a biology of the mind, a science of the mind. One of the main difficulties we're now having then with the Freudian metaphors is that they are in a thought system that doesn't fit us today. When Einstein came along, classical physics was blown to smithereens. After Einstein, we had the quantum physicists, and now we have the chaos physicist and the turbulence physicist. None of these people use 19th century modes of thought anymore. Clinicians are the last ones. Okay? If we think that psychoanalysis or our therapies are scientific, we're the last people using the old model. It's time that we shifted out of it. Quantum physicists know too well that subjectivity is where their discipline begins. It's who I am, where I stand, what I'm observing that makes the difference in terms of what I see. We don't know what a quantum leap is. We can state a probability that particle A will be where particle B, where particle B should be, but we don't have any idea what happens. The quantum physicists have blown apart completely our human notion of what reality is that we've evolved since the beginning of human life. We think that there is a reality out there, that there are things to observe, that if we can just know enough, we'll know what that reality is, and we'll know about the relations between those things that are out there in the world. No physicist any longer believes that. There are different ways of thinking. And the chaos theorists have taken us to another whole dimension in which they're noticing strange attractors based on mathematical matrices that govern such things as flow, the way the cigarette smoke curls, that are realities that we can't pin down in any way that we've ever thought of before. If you haven't started studying quantum physics and chaos, it's time to do it. Our bookstores are full of wonderful paperbacks. In the countertransference book, I go over and summarize some of the basic points that these people are making and the implications for our field, and I list in a footnote there about a dozen of my favorite books. It's like any thinking person now needs to be aware that human reality is not what it ever was, and all of our basic ideas are not tenable anymore. So when we look at the whole structure of our field, it's still based upon the idea of there being certain entities, certain things that people can define, and we continue to think that knowledge is going to do it. It won't help. It's not knowledge. Right. It's a question of defining where we are and noticing what we see and trying to find concepts that make sense of it. Systematic subjectivity. Joseph Natterson just published a book a few months ago, Beyond Countertransference. Jason Aronson did it. It's a wonderful thing. I just reviewed it for the Division 39 newsletter. He points out, he's a psychoanalyst from Beverly Hills, he points out that what happens is that we have repressed subjectivity in psychoanalysis, and it's come around instead and shown up in displaced and condensed forms elsewhere, and we've been surprised. So we have to begin owning our subjectivity. So all of my writings and lectures are now encouraging us to begin to focus on who we are and our subjective experience, and to make that a systematic, responsible part of the work that we're doing. So one of our tasks, I think, is how to begin developing subjectivity as a responsible tool for working. The next trend I'd like to observe is the movement from historical truth to narrative truth. Donald Spence has a book by that titled. Roy Schaefer has written numerous papers on the same subject. The question that we basically have to address is, why did we ever think it was possible to know the history of a human being? That we've deluded ourselves into thinking that as we sit around, we're talking about the real mother or what really happened, and that people begin to tell about their childhood. And yet we know, every time we meet somebody new, we tell a different story about ourselves. Okay? Many of you in Southern California, divorce is a rather common thing. You notice, as the divorce is happening, you tell someone this story, you tell another person this story, you tell your child this story, you tell your neighbor this story. 3 months later, you're telling this story and this story and this story. 6 years later, there's a different story and a different story. The thing that Spence and Schaefer are pointing out to us is that human life and the truth of human existence has always been expressed in images, myths, archetypes, stories. And that there's nothing that we can look at about these that is scientific in the Newtonian sense. Human truth has a different cast, a different feel. And so, one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to listen to what are the stories and what are the narrations that people tell. And at different developmental levels, the way that the stories go is very different. So we'll be trying to apply this to the organizing level later today. I've already touched on the movement from relativity to quantum realities. It's a whole shift of a point of view, a worldview shift that's in progress now. One of the things that science was fond of doing was defining mythical beasts. Mythical beasts have existed in all times, in all cultures. I spent 3 whole days at UCI Library once because I had to keep going back because all the books on mythical beasts, fascinating, you know, dragons and the stories of this and the stories of that, and from China. And I was trying to think, what is the function of all of these mythical beasts? What are they doing? The conclusion that I came to is that a mythical beast is a cultural construction that expresses a human truth. We ourselves project ourselves into this beast. It's a beast with many qualities, many colors, many different kinds of adventures and misadventures. But in the midst of it, by the time the story is told and retold and we address a certain sort of beast, we know ourselves better and our culture evolves. Think of the unicorn, our favorite beast in Western civilization. You know, all of the interesting stories about the unicorn. And there are unicorns. There are reliable witnesses. I read their accounts. Men of the clergy, men of nobility, reliable reporters who are telling about their encounter with the unicorn. Now, as we look at the whole series of unicorn paintings and unicorn art, we're aware that there's many different stories, but basically we've got the problem between the unicorn and the virgin. Okay. The virgin is typically, I have a virgin here today. Where did she go? Yes. Yes. This is the good mother. We'll be talking about good mothers and bad mothers later. So this is the virgin. The virgin in relationship to the unicorn is often seen as seated demurely inside of a little white picket fence, safely. The unicorn, however, is moving around, lying down, seated, but usually with that horn just over the edge of the fence, guarding her, protecting her. Is she deceiving him? Is he deceiving her? And in the background are the hounds and the hunters, the horses, the dangerous, violent masculine images. If anyone wants to know about the horrors of masculinity, we just have to open the books of Greek mythology and find out what those are. So Stuart Schneiderman tells us in his wonderful book about angels that as Western civilization has progressed, we've had to systematically tamper down the horrors of masculinity as seen in the Greek myth. So in the unicorn beast, we have then the unicorn relating to the virgin. Now as we study all of the stories and all of the pictures, we begin to realize that for 500 or 600 years, the problem of the relationship between men and women, lust, love, respect, virginity, God and man, was being studied through this mythical beast. At some point, certain balances were hit, and that particular myth was no longer going to be the way in which people could talk about the differences, the relationship between the sexes. In our field, we have a wonderful book, a great big one. You all have one in your office. It's a big, fat book. I call it the Noah's Ark of Mythical Beasts. It's the DSM-3. The question is there really a hysteric? Is there really a borderline? Is there really a narcissist? And it's sort of as though, well, if there's the talons of a hawk, the scales of a fish, little tough shooting poisonous darts, then you can be sure what it is. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful in speaking of the DSM-3 because we know that it's been many, many years being developed, and it's probably the most interesting compendium of descriptions about human lifestyles that's ever been collected. But the difficulty is always, we may be able to categorize and classify, and it serves certainly a legal purpose, certainly it's and a medical purpose, but if we begin to believe in these mythical beasts, we lose track of the fact that we have a human being sitting across from us in our consulting rooms. And I think that we're happy to see the evolution of the mythical beast structure move forward because this is how human thought moves forward. Human thought moves by projecting ourselves onto an outside structure, a beast, a DSM-3. This is the way people are. And we've noticed from DSM-1 to DSM-2 to DSM-3, there's been major transformations in the way we think about the field and the way we think about ourselves. So I think that we can look forward to other DSMs and we'll begin to find that they will reflect our thought system as it evolves. But for practical purpose in our consulting room, I think what we're wanting to do is to move away from the mythical beast and rather move more in the direction that than the physicists, the chemists, the people in other disciplines have gone, and translated the overall view to our field. It would be to listening perspectives. Where are we standing? When we stand in this place, what do we see? What does it appear to us? How does this affect us when we stand in this place, when we raise these questions, when we do this? And so we have a series of listening perspectives that are evolving in our field. Listening perspectives don't tell us what's out there. They help us organize what's in here and what's in our bodies. They help us have a sense of how we can begin to create a certain kind of experience in our consulting rooms that's going to permit transformation of two people, ourselves and the other person that's there with us. Claude Levi-Strauss, in an interesting paper, he's an anthropologist, on childbirth, pointed out that what psychoanalysts have is not knowledge about the human mind. There is no such thing. What psychoanalysts have, and have evolved over 100 years, is knowledge about how to produce an experience. We arrange the setting of our room, we organize ourselves in a certain way, and we hope to hold ourselves in a certain way so that an experience can evolve. and that the knowledge is the knowledge that we are evolving about how to permit people to have certain kinds of experiences. We call them growth experiences, transformational experiences, analytic experiences, whatever. But our knowledge is how to begin arranging things so that people can have an experience. And we're taken back, once again, to the problem of early mothering. How is it that each mother arranges an experience for her infant and for her infant to grow? The last aspect of the paradigm shift, then, is parallel to the evolution of listening perspectives as frames of reference. It's the emphasis on the movement from frame technique to variable responsiveness. We all learn frame technique in graduate school. We know where it came from. We know that the general idea is to hold constant the perceptual situation of the consulting room in such a way that the neurotic conflict has an opportunity to appear. Frame technique still works for neurotic conflict. We are not seeing neurotic conflict in our consulting rooms today, okay? Occasionally. Mostly we're seeing pre-neurotic things. And we begin to realize that there are neurotic conflicts in the world. We know what they are, but we also see a whole series of other things. And as we begin to shift our frames of reference with different people and at different moments with the same person, we begin to become aware that optimal responsiveness to foster this experience is going to change, so that the frame technique becomes, if you will, almost a naive morality. You should do it this way, shouldn't do it that way, and so forth. It evolved for a very specific purpose, but mostly that purpose is not what we are dealing with today. So I think it's very important for us to know the frame technique and know when its application is the most important thing, and then to begin understanding other ways of being. Heinz Kohut introduced us, first of all, to the whole idea of self-to-self object resonance. And so there's a whole different way of being with a person. A group of writers have talked about how to be with people at yet an earlier level, at a symbiotic level. And in listening perspectives, I talk about studying the set of scenarios that evolve between two people. And today we'll be talking about the organizing level, so that how we can be with a person is going to shift depending upon the developmental level of the issue being concerned. Some people live a certain developmental level predominant in their lives. The rest of us live different layers at different moments in our lives. So let me then move to the listening perspectives as I wrote them in 1983 in the Listening Perspectives book. I have two charts for this today because I have an earlier version and a later version, so you can see my own evolution. The earlier version of here, and it's basically the table of contents of the Listening Perspectives book. In fact, you know, sometimes people say, you know, we've always talked about psychosis and schizophrenia and so forth, and you keep talking about the organizing experience. Where did you get that idea? Well, it came from trying to adjust the table of contents to this book. We have basically 4 different levels that we're going to talk about, developmental levels. In this level, it's plus or minus 4 months. In the second level, symbiosis, we're going to talk basically 4 to 24 months. The third year of life, the self-other, the narcissistic level, and then the Oedipal level, the one that Freud first talked about. You have them there in your chart. Otto Kernberg came up with such a wonderful idea when he began talking about the symbiotic level, level 2, when he stopped saying borderlines and started saying borderline personality organization. It was like, wait a minute, there's a shift. The shift that says we're not looking at mythical beasts, but we're looking rather at a way in which people organize their personality. And as we've studied it, it's a way that we all organize our personalities, but at a 2-year-old level, the kind of organization we have at 2. When he was doing a conference not long ago up at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, Jerry Ormland was doing a discussion of his paper. And Jerry Ormland said, he had just read a paper on narcissism. You've given us this wonderful term, Otto, borderline personality organization. Why do you now speak about narcissistic disturbances? Why don't you speak about narcissistic personality organization? Another shift, a subtle shift in thought. So when I was writing my book, and I needed to do a whole section on neurosis and Freud, and to go back to Freud's basic metapsychology and where Freud's thinking came from, I was still stuck with neurosis. And then one day, neurotic personality organization. That You see how we're shifting away? A step at a time, inch at a time. Isn't that how we learn to get away from sexist language? You'd catch yourself doing something you didn't want to do, and you'd shift. And then you'd do it again, and you'd shift. In my manuscript that just came back from the publisher, there was not one instance of sexist language. We're going to win. So I had 3 personality organizations, and I'm thinking, okay, now this table of contents is starting to shape up here. What about this chapter on psychosis? What kind of organization is that? And I'm thinking about schizophrenia and mania and depression and one thing and another. And then it's just like a flash of light. People are organizing. It's this constant search. And then I began to remember Kafka. Organizing, organizing, searching, searching. And Suzanne made me watch plenty this week. I was up at 7 o'clock watching Meryl Streep do Plenty. If you haven't seen it, it's a movie that it's in the video stores now. An incredible account of what organizing personality. We have being there Jerzy Kosinski's character, but there it's clearer. Here, Meryl Streep is this beautiful, well-put-together woman who travels in high-ranking circles of nobility and international diplomacy, and yet you see underlying again and again and again the return to the organizing experience, which in fact dominates her life. And I think it's a very important film for us to see. In fact, I think probably in the spring I'll do a Friday night discussion on it, because I think it's called Plenty, Meryl Streep. The organizing experience, about as all we can define it, is that it's what an infant does in utero to organize to meet the environment, setting up channels. We used to think that, you know, infants and fetuses were helpless little blank creatures. We now know that nothing could be further from the truth. Fetuses are active. They're extracting, they're searching, they're demanding. And now we have a number of transference phenomena that seem very clearly to go back to intrauterine experiences in which things went wrong. And the baby's attempt to connect in utero did not work. And the whole psyche is built upon that terror, that fear. I'll bring you some later in the day. In the earliest months after birth, we've got the same thing happening. That is, the infant needs to have an opportunity, initially, to not be too traumatized by the change of environment. Winnicott says the sense of going on being is crucial. And so for that, we need total maternal preoccupation in the first weeks and months until the baby begins to orient to the outside world. Gradually, the child then begins to organize channels, begins to cue mother, mother begins to cue him, threads of connectedness to the outside environment begin, and soon mommy and me are doing a dance. This is the most powerful thing in our culture and in our lives, the mommy and me dance, the symbiosis. Those of you that know about the tachistoscopic studies, where something is flashed momentarily, subliminally, and people will do anything for one phrase. One phrase. Mommy and me are one. It's the most powerful, motivating phrase in the English language. Not mother and me, not mother and I, not daddy and me, not mommy and me are one. And so it tells us how powerful the symbiotic experience is, our wish to have that sense of merger back. So as the child then begins organizing channels to a mutual cueing system into the symbiosis, it happens from the beginning, but we arbitrarily say by the 4th month, because we can see it. We begin to see, she's becoming a child. Look, she's smiling. Look, she's holding my fingers. Look, she's squeezing. So we have, slowly, the mother begins to impinge with her ideas of what children should be like, how to grow up. Baby begins to make demands, and we begin to have a dance. By the end of the 2nd year, we have something else beginning that mothers call the terrible twos. Freud called it negation. Freud says that the key element in human thought, the development of human culture, the development of human language, is the word no. It's not until negation can be accomplished that the human mind is alive to imagination. In negation, we can imagine something other than what is. So it's not until the child begins opposing, saying no, that the way we really experience the differentiated human mind begins to develop. And I don't have to tell you, all the people that you call borderlines in your offices, they haven't learned to say no, not to their mothers. And so, for 5 years, we work on teaching no. And people begin to get better, and unfortunately, their mothers go through a great deal of suffering. By the time the no is accomplished, if the mother has been able to handle it, and the opposition begins, then we see what Kohut has called for us, the development of the self. Look at me. See how strong I am. See what good mud pies I can make. See what a pretty dress I have on. See how fast I can run. Look, I'm jumping. Yes, darling. Kohut says, people have trouble at this level when there's an adventure outside. The child comes dashing in to tell mother, I did this, I did this, I did this. And mother's busy, straighten your hair, darling. Here, your belt's crooked. Do this. And the whole sense of self collapses. So in the 3rd year of life, the vulnerability that we see is to the developing, the nascent sense of self. Kohut has talked about this and how it appears in the clinical situation in terms of the mirroring that's involved in self-development, in terms of the twinning, the identical, we are alike, we see things the same way, and in terms of the idealization aspect of it. You know, my daddy's the best daddy in the world, my mommy can bake the best apple pies, whatever it is, that all of those things have the effect of making me feel strong about myself. And in the 4th listening perspective, we have the one that was first defined by Freud, perhaps best mythically expressed by the myth of Oedipus, where we have triangulations in relatedness. We're no longer dealing with mommy and me. We're no longer, as with narcissism or the self-object, dealing with my using the other to affirm myself. We're now dealing with triangles. If you're my mother and you're my father, I then begin to deal with what works between us. And I'm with my mother, and I know I have one relationship with her. And we do our fun things, and we do this and we do that, and he walks through the door. Well, everything shifts. We are not the same. And when I'm with my father, we have our games. We do the things that we do. When she walks through the door, it's different. How is it different? What changes? And then when they go in the bedroom and lock the door, this is what Freud called castration. Okay? My power is robbed because my parents have a relationship with each other that I am not part of. I no longer feel the same sense of power that I once had in the dyad. So that what makes, for me, the Oedipus complex come alive is the study of triangles that every well-developed child has to go through. Who is who to whom in this little party? And it's not just mommy, daddy, and me, because particularly not now with preschools and so forth. It's every possible triangulation in the world. So the child at ages 3, 4, 5, and 6 is busy studying the problem of triangles and what happens to me when I get left out. My sense of safety, my sense of power are robbed from me. The Oedipus myth, as you know, is a tragedy. Oedipus blinds himself because he lusted after his mother and killed his father. It's the story of repression, blinding ourselves to our lust and to our rage. Retold in Hamlet. Heinz Kohut never liked this myth very well. He said the problem and the reason that the Oedipus complex has been so overemphasized in psychoanalysis is because Oedipus' parents abandoned him at birth. Parents who don't abandon, parents who love their children, parents who are proud of the aggression and the assertion and the development and of the seductions and the excitement and the sexuality of the developing child, they affirm these things in the child in a very different way, in a self-fulfilling way. So Kohut, in the paper that he was to deliver at the 50th anniversary of the celebration of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, his son had to read the paper because it was several months after he died. But in that paper, he provides us another myth, taken from Homer, the myth of Telemachus, the infant son of Odysseus. The kings are going to oppress the other king into the war. He doesn't want to go. He's got a young boy, he's got a wife, he's got a family, but the Trojan War is about to begin. The kings arrive to impress him, but what he has done is he's feigning madness. He's got a plow with an ox on one side and a mule on the other side. He's wearing a dunce hat, and he's throwing salt in the furrows instead of seeds. He's mad. One of the kings takes his infant son and throws it in front of the plow. whereupon he makes a semicircle around, demonstrating his sanity. Kohut says, when we have parents that are affirming of their growing instinctual life of children, we don't have an Oedipus tragedy. We have something else. When we move to the symbiotic level, I've come up with a different kind of mythical rendition of that. I'm interested in the Roman god Janus. January. Janus was the god of all beginnings. I think we begin to realize that it is in the symbiosis that whatever it is we call ourselves, that whatever it is that's human life begins as the mother and the child have a bonding experience. Janus has been sometimes talked about as two-faced. That was no part of Roman mythology. Janus had two faces, but they were the face of youth and maturity. Entering the north portal of the forum and entering the face of Janus as an infant or a boy, the youth, could be seen. Once inside the forum with the people, Janus was a bearded, mature man. So that I think that the portal to human life is through the symbiosis. It's the way in which we get our humanity from doing our bonding dance with Mother. At the organizing level, I am grateful to Bill Young for this myth. He heard me talk about listening perspectives once, and he's the director over at CGI now. He said, well, what about the myth of Proteus? Proteus, and so I went running to my dictionary of mythological characters, and sure enough, here's this wonderful myth. Aristeus was a beekeeper, and his bees died. The social instincts are in trouble. He is the son of Apollo and of Cyrene, a water nymph. So he goes to his mother and tells his mother that his bees have died, his social instincts are in trouble. What shall he do? She sends him to Proteus. Proteus is the god of the sea, not Neptune, but all of the flocks and the tribes, the social animals beneath the sea. Proteus is the god of all time and all forms. So his mother says, you will not be able to ask him this question simply. He'll do everything that he can. He'll change forms 1,000,000 times and to escape you. But he sleeps every afternoon on the Isle of Carpathos with the seals. And if you surprise him in his sleep and chain him to the rock, he'll go through all sorts of terrifying forms, but finally, he'll settle down, and you can ask him your question. And so Aristeus did this. All manner of time distortions, time warps, form warps occurred. So we're into the unconscious, we're into the land of infancy, we're of timelessness, of formlessness, of all of the things that happen. And we certainly know that organizing experiences that fill our consulting rooms have a myriad of forms and time periods. And finally, Aristeus tells him the problem. He needs to harness the bees. Proteus says, go and make sacrifices to the gods, and leave the carcasses of the animals for 9 days, and when you return, there will be bees. And there were. By going to the gods, through his mother, going to the fathers, to the social structure, making sacrifices to those who have gone before, the social instincts can become tamed, become manageable for productive life. And I think the task of the organizing period is very much this way, to take the basic instinctual life and move it into social life. This morning, what I covered was the general backdrop to the organizing experience. I think you have some understanding that the organizing experience, for us to take the kind of approach that we want to take, we have to realize that we're working now in a world of self and others. We're working with a paradigm in which we're studying the narrational truths that get brought. And we're also working with a different developmental level, so that our technique and our way that we think about things, the way in which people communicate, changes drastically from the way that we would ordinarily work. So this afternoon we're going to move into the process of working. I have a metaphor that Joyce and I worked out that will organize the afternoon. We're going to go through 16 points. We have Freud here to make sure we're doing things right. The metaphor is an infant's arm reaching out to touch mother. the organizing path, the attempt to organize my mind by reaching out, hopefully finding. So the 16 points are going to go along the searching into the movement, finding contact, moving towards the symbiosis and development, or at some point, if the contact is not met, if there's a contact failure, there's a withdrawal. And what happens then? So the afternoon will be organized around that path, the path to organize experience by reaching out and finding an other, and whether you do find or whether you don't find, and what happens to you.
Recently, I read Margaret Little's account of her analysis with Winnicott, and I imagine a number of you have read that. But I was very impressed with her experience because she was an analyst. At the time, Winnicott really was able to connect with her in her organizing pocket. And I wanted to read that to you because I know that you're very aware of Margaret Little and Winnicott as well, of course. She said this about her therapy with Winnicott. He gave few interpretations, and only those when I had already reached the point where the matter could become conscious. Then, of course, the interpretation would ring true. He was not fallible, but often spoke tentatively or speculated, saying things like, I think perhaps, or I wonder if, or it seems as if. This let me taste or feel what he said and be free to accept or reject it. Interpretations were not given as if I had access to symbolic function where I had not. This, in contrast to a previous analysis with Ella Sharp, who interpreted my fear as castration anxiety and related it to my having met her through Dr. X, which was, of course, the obvious thing, for the problem I had taken to her was clearly Oedipal. But this did not fit the intensity of my panic, which was far more than any mortal terror or fear of death. For her, mortal terror meant fear of the classical superego, to which good is equated with non-sexual and bad with sexual. My fear, and she quotes from Jane Eyre, such dread that children only can feel, was of utter destruction, being bodily dismembered, driven irretrievably insane, wiped out, abandoned, and forgotten by the whole world as one who had never been. And then she quotes Matthew 23, cast into outer darkness. My overall picture of my analysis with Miss Sharp is one of constant struggle between us. She insisting on interpreting what I said as due to intrapsychic conflict to do with infantile sexuality, and I trying to convey to her that my real problems were matters of existence and identity. How often I have heard this. I did not know what myself was. Sexuality, even if known, was totally irrelevant and meaningless unless existence and survival could be taken for granted and personal identity established. I thought that was a marvelous account of a therapist, you know, who was herself an analyst, who became aware of something that she tried to convince another analyst existed for her, and that analyst, you know, had a structure that she could not move out of to hear what her client was saying to her. And on the organizing level, it is so important that you set aside all your preconceptions and you listen to what they're saying to you. Now, we're going to move into asking ourselves a question: why do people not organize? And in essence, in a nutshell, we have a very simple response. They cannot find mother. If I cannot find mother, I will not organize, at least not in a healthy way. I may organize in a psychotic world, but we're not talking about that kind of organization. Okay, how come they can't find mother? We made a list of a number of types of mothers that cannot be found. Mother may simply be a mother who's preoccupied. She's just into her things, her schedule, her activities, herself, her world, whatever. But she's preoccupied and she's not really there for the infant. Mother may have a negative response to the child. Maybe she didn't want to be pregnant, maybe she didn't want to have a child, maybe she didn't want a child at that time, maybe she didn't want that sex, and so there's some resistance to really reaching out and being there for that particular infant. It's possible that the mother was separated from the infant for an extended period of time, say because of illness, either her own or the infant's illness. And I'm really impressed with what hospitals are doing, especially when infants have to stay in the hospital. My niece had triplets. They're now 4, and I've been very involved with them. She lives in Sacramento, and I flew up when they were born, and I went to the hospital and got to be part of that process. And it was a marvelous learning experience for me because they wanted us to massage and touch those infants, and they allowed us to bring in tape recordings of the mother's voice and played the tape recordings during the day to each of the triplets. We brought in musical fluffy toys, and you know, we were just really involved with them as much as we could possibly be. And the triplets came home in about, I think it was 7 or 8 days, and they're just doing marvelously. And we think some of that has to do with how the hospital allowed the family to do anything and everything that they could so that that bonding, that connection could occur. There can also be negative in utero experiences. Drugs may be a factor. Larry reminded me of the RH factor that may affect the relationship. Arteriosclerosis of the umbilicus that prevents adequate nutrition from happening, and so that having an adverse effect on the infant mother. Right, noxia, someone is suggesting. All right, a fragmented mother, one who's not organized herself, and she just doesn't have it to give to the infant. I'm going over these quickly because of time today. Mother's lack of knowledge. She may try to regulate the infant too early, for example. Winnicott suggests that a mother should be adaptable to an infant's needs until the infant is able to react in anger rather than being traumatized by her failure. I thought that was interesting measure of how to know, when to be involved and when not to. He posits that trauma results from breaking the continuity of the line of individual existence. So we need to remain involved until that infant can get angry, and then we'll know it won't be as traumatic for that mother to regulate the infant. Mother in grief, and I've had a number of experiences where mothers have been in grief, loss of a mate or some other kind of major loss, maybe illness, major illness on her part. And again, Larry reminded me that Frances Tustin, in working with functionally autistic children, found that primarily the mothers of autistic children were depressed and therefore unavailable. Absorbing mothers, mothers who want to take the infant in, and that does not allow for the infant to reach out and find that connection and organize around that experience. Mothers who cannot tolerate the psychical impact of the infant experiencing her as part of himself. Again, Tustin says, quote, "There seems to be a period immediately after birth in which the child reacts to the outside world in terms of his own body and its inbuilt dispositions. This establishes his body image as a basis for personal identity. This early time is a stage when experience with body-centered sensation objects, which is part of his body, prepares the infant for later relationships with not-self objects, experienced as separate from his body, to which he has to learn to adjust." Another is, and we've implied this already, Larry has this morning, limited responses to the baby's potentials for creative encounters. You know, the baby just has loads of potential possibilities for encounters, and mother is not always going to be there to respond to those. And so that's why all of us have organizing pockets. In some cases, the child, the infant, could not use the nurturing that was there to be used, and research supports that. And then lastly, thinking of Winnicott again, talking about the environment, mother not providing the needed supply as a defense against intolerable anxiety. Mother does need to be good enough, which is one of his terms. So these are just a few suggestions as to why an infant may not be able to find mother.
When I first started trying to grasp the idea of the organizing experience, I was trying to think, who has told us about it? And I already mentioned this morning the work of Franz Kafka. If you haven't read Kafka recently, it's worth going down to Brentano's and seeing what you can come up with. The book for which Kafka is most remembered, of course, is The Castle. In The Castle, the central character, K, notice he doesn't have a name, there's only an initial, not quite a human being. K is a land surveyor. So Kafka knew about boundaries. Okay? K arrives at the foot of the castle hill, which to many has been said is the image of a breast. The castle is through the mist, high on the hill, unavailable. He can hear tinkling sounds through the cold night. The snow is deep, and he stops at the tavern. He announces that the castle has sent for him. He has a job, and he'd like to stay. Whereupon everyone laughs at him. The castle never sends for anybody, and of course there's no place for you here to stay. But he insists, and finally he picks up the telephone that's connected to the castle, and it's like the sound of 1,000 children's voices. All the way through Kafka, there's auditory images. Sound, sound, sound. So many infants have to rely on sound because that's the only contact they have with the maternal body. Moving through the house, they can hear her, but she doesn't touch us. Throughout this whole novel, then, most of you have read it, Kay searching for a way to the castle. He starts up one street, and he can't quite make it. Another person is going to help him, and just when he thinks he's about to get there, that doesn't work. He goes through affairs. He relates to children. One incredible scene after another, and they're all like nightmares because he can't reach the castle. Many people have thought this was Kafka's, this was autobiographical because he couldn't finish the novel. It's unfinished. But he often read. He would have soirees, and in reading, one night, he concluded, and he told his friends how the story was to end. After a long life of searching, Kay is on his deathbed. His friends are gathered around. Suddenly, a messenger arrives from the castle, and there's this cryptic message. The message says, "You may stay and work in the village, but not because you were sent for, not because you were needed, but for extraneous reasons." So many of these people will tell us exactly that story. I thought I was sent for, but there was no one here to receive me. The guilt, the primary guilt that gets felt, is portrayed in the trial. What is my guilt? 2 men in white coats arrive one morning to take me away. The rest of the book is, what is my crime? What did I do? And through nightmarish, we think our courts are bad. Through nightmarish experiences, trying to find access to justice, to what is my crime. In the last scene, he bares his chest to the knife. My crime is being alive. My crime is wanting more from my mother than she was able to give. Searles puts it from his schizophrenic patients in terms of my guilt is that I was not a good enough baby to give my mother what she needed so that she could be whole and consolidated and mother me. That's my crime. In Listening Perspectives, I've outlined some other of Kafka's stories, and they're well worth reviewing because the organizing experience is nowhere been better portrayed. There's a new novel you might make a note of by a German writer with the unlikely German name, Patrick Suskind, S-U-S-K-I-N-D. Suzanne turned me onto it. Perfume is the name of it. It picks up on the olfactory sense. All of these people will tell you about smells. Your room has a specific odors, you have an odor. We know that infants, I think within 48 hours, are able to identify on one side a pad with their mother's milk, another mother's milk, and they will always turn. So the olfactory sense is very well developed, and so there are all sorts of olfactory images. In perfume, we're sent back to Paris in the 17th century on the site of the old burial ground for the plagues, on the site of an old cemetery, which then became the fish market, and all of the smells of Paris in the 17th century come alive in the first few pages, and you remember all the ways that people smelled, fish smells, rotting, stinking, corpses, and all this. And in the middle of this, a boy is born. His mother didn't want him, and she shuffles him off into the trash with the fish heads. Someone discovers it. The police come along. She's beheaded promptly. And we have a boy who now grows up in these kind of conditions. His name is Grenouille, French for frog. His entire life is organized by smell. We have an incredible picture. It's a beautiful thing to read of how everything in his life becomes organized according to the olfactory sense. And he searches and searches and searches. And what do we finally realize he's searching for? The smell of perfect beauty. And then we have quite a surrealistic ending that I'll save for you to read. It's a very brave novel, but it's an adventure in smell. The other novelist that's helped us understand this, of course, is Jerzy Kosinski, particularly in his book, Being There. You've seen the movie, no doubt, by Peter Sellers, in which the young man, as a young boy, is in a mansion in Washington, D.C., and he never leaves the mansion, and he never knows any outside people. He knows the colored maid that feeds him. And the old man, who's a wealthy man that lives upstairs, occasionally sees him, and all he has is the television set. And so he learns his entire way of being through the television set. And we watch him mimicking, imitating. And then, of course, we have the most fabulous sex scene that's ever been filmed with Peter Sellers and Shirley MacLaine. When he finally is moved out into the world, he doesn't know anything. But every time he opens his mouth, he's speaking in such metaphors. People think he's powerful, and within 2 days, he's on CBS television talking about the international state of the economy and making it like a garden. The garden's the only thing that he knows. The colored maid sees him on there, and she says, "It sure is a white man's world. He has got nothing but bread puddings between his ears." This incredible sex scene. Shirley MacLaine has been putting the make on him for some time. Finally, she says in desperation, "How do you like it?" Well, the only thing he knows to say is, "I like to watch." So you could just see her wheels turning. So the television set, and Jerzy Kosinski did this, he was responsible for the screenplay as well. Brilliant man. I'm sorry, he was quite ill and killed himself a while back, not long ago. But and in every scene there's a television set. And if you go study the movie, what's going on in this here is mimicked in the background on the television set. It's an incredible piece of art. So calisthenics are being done on the television set, a large canopied bed. We see Chance, whose name people insist on misunderstanding is Chancier Gardenier. He's Chance the gardener. So everyone sees him. He's on his head doing calisthenics. Shirley MacLaine in her black negligee is over on a bearskin rug, the jaws opening to the camera, masturbating to orgasm in the middle of this, and he's not quite sure what it's all about. But he's watching. And it's a pathetic thing. And of course, the movie has the surprise ending where he's really the only person to be elected as President of the United States. So the quest for reliable contact. Do you have comments on that? We're going to...
How can I follow that? I think we ought to follow that by our depiction of...
the psychotic mother. Okay. Now, the last talk we had a Freud pinata, but I went back to the pinata store, and we have the psychotic mother. Now, the problem that Joyce and I have had as we wanted to talk about this subject, and we wanted to try to talk about mothers, is it's so difficult to talk about the experience of being afraid of contact, and to take it back to the primary mothering situation, without pointing the finger at that mother. And that doesn't seem to be right. So by talking about reaching out and finding a terrifying experience there, we're talking about something that we all know about. And what happens is we recoil in fear from the mother. So it's not the real mother as God sees her. The real mother was just taken off of her pedestal. God sees mothers in a different way, but this is meant as an internal representation. And so every time I wanted to talk about the psychotic mother, I've had difficulty in it seeming as though I'm talking about a real person, or I'm talking about that mother. We're really talking about an experience of a frightening experience that one withdraws from. And so we have here the psychotic mother, and so I want to make certain, and I brought her today, to make certain that we understand she's an abstraction. This is an abstraction. All right.
In reference to the breast and how significant that is to an infant, and I'll share just a portion of a session. She said, "I just feel hollow inside, like the breast was hollow inside. It feels like a betrayal. It makes me feel like wanting to kill myself. There is nothing in the breast. I need it, and it is not there. Somebody took it away. Somebody did not want me to have it. It is a horrible feeling. It feels like a scream in outer space. Nobody can hear the scream. It is like all the vital nutrients are not there, and I cannot live without them." There was pathos in her voice as she shared about her internalized experience of not having mother breast and finding it empty and feeling the loss of the nutrition that she needed to become alive.
So that we start with the search for contact. And then in our consulting rooms, the next thing that strikes us is what I've chosen to call reflexive content. That is, we hear all sorts of stories. Sometimes it's a story about multiple selves. Sometimes it's a story that contains hallucinations, sometimes delusions, sometimes eating difficulties, sometimes body parts, sometimes machines, outer space. There are all sorts of content to the variety of organizing experiences, and often it's not even in terms of words, but rather in terms of behaviors or affects, the way in which people live their life and move in our consulting room. And so I want to categorize all of the various content of whatever category as reflexive in nature. Now, it seems to me that the thing that we've learned in working with organizing people over the years has been that it's a cardinal error to listen to the content. The whole idea of entering the psychotic world, making sense of the content, decoding the symbols, doesn't work. We've had wonderful research projects. We've had many people write. A lot of various things happen. But ultimately what happens is we find that the reflexive content should not be listened to. The example that I had, that was a woman that came some time ago with a man. The correct diagnosis would have been manic psychosis. She drove herself nearly crazy listening to this man, trying to decipher it, trying to make sense of it. He had this to tell, 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 and she's racing around trying to follow it all. Several years later, I saw her and she says, "I've learned never to listen to a single word he says." And I said, "What?" She says, "He comes to tell me something much more important than anything he can put into words. And if I start listening to the words, I get off track." She said, "I take a deep breath before I open the door to my waiting room. And when I open the door, what I see is what I get that day." Sometimes he's straightening up the magazines in the magazine rack. Sometimes he's shuffling through papers. Sometimes he's straightening the pictures on the wall. Other times he's slumped down in his chair. Other times he's there waiting for me on the edge of his chair to meet me. And she says, what I see at that moment, I know that's where we are today. And so he comes in and he talks 1,000,000 miles an hour and tells me a great many things. And when we finally get around to where it seems as though he's telling me about what I see, what I know to be there, we begin focusing on that. So I think that the content, no matter what form it takes, is not anything to be listened to. But in order to make that clearer, what we're talking about, I want to go back a bit into Freudian theory. Freud's first model of the mind was published in 1900. He had some earlier ideas that were later published, but his first published model was in the Interpretation of Dreams in the 7th chapter. And he drew a series of diagrams like this because the metaphor that he was using was that of a reflex arc. Interesting, he's almost using the arm as well. You know, you reach out, do you get burned? What do you remember? So the reflex arc, which was very popular in 19th century thought. But Freud also then is using the metaphor in that passage of a compound optical instrument, a telescope, a microscope, and how, as a result of the long tube, without any lenses in between, you can look either direction. But when lenses begin to be put along, the optical experience becomes unidirectional. He's suggesting that our minds work that way, that as we begin to have experiences, it's like adding lenses, and in the reflex arc then comes to take a certain direction. And the direction is from perception to movement. So that by the time we have a well-developed person, we see or hear things, and then we move to respond to them. But that is the direction of development. Now, if we were to see, this is the end that perception comes in. This is the motor end, the movement, the innervation end. This would be the, using his metaphor, the telescope with the various sets of memories. Now, what sort of memories then get built up? In Freud's first rendition, he was talking about a series of memories that then slowly become organized into unconscious, here, and preconscious, and finally conscious thoughts, so that a whole series of experiences lead into the paradigm that Freud first used to understand dreams. He was working in that chapter, or that particular section, on hallucinatory dreams. He was saying, his question was, why are some dreams so vivid that they're practically like hallucinations? So he's saying, ordinarily, from perception to motor would not permit hallucinations. When Freud, in 1923, set up the structural paradigm of id, ego, and superego, we might well think that the lenses in the telescope could be replaced with the agencies, the mental agencies, I, it, and the over-I, so that still again, Freud's basic movement from perception to motor would follow the same paradigm. If we're now to convert this to the third listening paradigm that we're talking about today, the relatedness paradigm, we've got the same model. Our perceptions are coming in, but what we realize now, we're wanting to fill in these lenses with a different concept. We're wanting to use self and other organization. And when I showed you the chart on the listening perspectives, you could see there were 4 different major modes that we could logically define of self and other relatedness. The organizing mode, okay, in which one is organizing a channel to the other. The symbiotic mode, in which a dance is being done with the other. The self-other mode, or the self-object mode, in which the other is being used to confirm the self. And the constant other mode of Oedipus complex, where there are 3 individual selves learning how to triangulate on one another. So that here, slowly, there would be a buildup of memories for the personality, but now, in the relatedness paradigm, we would think of them as being the memories of self and other experience. For those of you that are, the history goes back to Glover's idea of ego nuclei, which Kernberg has picked up, and he talks about a building block of experience is a representation of self, a representation of other, and an affect that links them. So that self and other representations always carry an affective charge. There's always an emotion with it. So those then would be the 3 paradigms. Now, let's imagine then for a moment an unorganized state prior to the time that perception goes in one end and comes out the other. And this is actually implied in Freud's text, where he's saying, before this happens, hallucinations are possible because the reflex arc, instead of moving in one direction, can move in both directions. Perception can hit the arc and go in movement. Movement can hit the arc and end up in perception. So with a raw psyche, an unformed psyche, one that has not yet been organized, the reflex arc could work either way. A movement sets up a perception, or perception sets up a movement, so that all sorts of things pass to and fro in mental activity without there being a definite direction or definite organization. Now, the thesis that we're putting forth here then about most of the so-called psychotic or organizing content is that if we begin to think of the mind, the earliest mind, as being able to move back and forth, that much of the content that we're going to hear during the hours is going to be reflexive in nature. It does not contain memories of self and other, or it only contains partial ones. So that whatever we're going to do in order to try to bring this person into human relatedness, it's not going to come from studying the reflexive content. It's going to come from reaching out and saying, be with me. And so in all of the people that we see in our consulting rooms, with all sorts of different ways of speaking about themselves, metaphors, images, symbols, which we'll talk about in a minute, we listen to these things in order to stay tuned with the images that they're there, but we're listening to the reflexive content more for purposes of conversation and empathy. But our pay dirt in this kind of work is not going to come from entering the psychotic state. And perhaps Joyce later will share with us some material in which, with Mary, she actually at one point is pressed to call Mary forth to be with her and to explain to Mary that when you go back into your psychotic world, it's not real. If you want to develop, you have to stay with me. And I think for those of us that have been trained in maintaining neutrality, that's a pretty radical stand. But the question is always neutrality with what? If we're maintaining neutrality with this level of development, the neutral stance is, stay here with me. We're going to develop together. So that the reflex arc of Freud's model, which he used to try to explain hallucinations, fits so very well for trying to understand the organizing experience in which all sorts of images, ideas, affects, bizarre thoughts, fragmented pieces float in and out of consciousness, but they are not connected to object relations memories. Or they are connected to an object relations memory, but it's this one. This is what's being remembered rather than the good mother. Okay?
With Mary, there was an experience that happened in her life. As I told you, she was in the helping profession area, and she had not maintained contact with the state agency that renewed licensures or renewed internship numbers and that kind of thing. And as a consequence, she was deleted from the list and is unable to now get an internship. And of course, she has talked over the years that someday, especially the last couple years, that someday she is going to be well, she's going to be organized, she is going to be able to utilize the material that she once learned but in her first internship was unable to apply. When she learned about this new state guideline that she was unfamiliar with, she came in just devastated, and she said, "My life is gone." And I was empathic. I said, "I can understand, and that's a tremendous loss, and it feels like, everything has just been flushed down the drain," and I tried to be with her in it. But I saw her give up. I just saw her, all the progress she had made was to no avail. It meant nothing now. There was no reason for her to continue progressing. And so in that session, in the next couple sessions,
I saw bugs in the brain come back. She was seeing blood on the wall, dripping on the wall. She was seeing heads of people on walls. She was seeing men in garments out on her paper route that she has. There were just all kinds of psychotic material that began returning, and I saw her really disengage from me, let go of the contact. So she came into the session, and she came in that manner, very drooped, you know, no contact with me, not even eye contact, and no obvious interest in it. And I felt if I did not do something strongly confrontive, I would lose her, that she had lost all will and desire to continue working on making contact on the deeper young levels. And so I said to her, I said, Mary, I can really see that out of this experience, you have chosen to no longer make contact with me. You've given up. And I said, I can understand your loss, but I said, I'm very upset. I said, we have worked together a very long time, very, very hard to come to the point where we are, and we have made tremendous strides. And you know it, and I know it. Something has happened that neither one of us planned on, and it is difficult. But we can talk about other possibilities at some point if you want to talk about those other possibilities. Right now, I understand that you're grieving a loss. But I am not going to let you go back into your psychotic world. I'm not going to do that. We have invested too much. You mean too much to me. I mean too much to you. And we're not giving this up. Do you understand that? And I could see just a glimmer of response in that session. And I saw movement, very gradual movement in the next several sessions. And then a number of sessions down the line from that, I said to her, Mary, I'd like to reflect a little bit. There's something I'd like to know. I said, I know that you get quite upset when I confront you. And if I feel angry to you, you oftentimes feel like, you know, you will explode or you will die. That's how you experience anger. And I said I was pretty forceful on that one day. And she said, if you had not drawn me into your world, I would have gone back into mine. You are the one that saved me from going back there and staying there. And I have, on a couple other occasions where she was disappointed in something, I've been confrontive, not quite that confrontive, but I feel with these individuals, especially when they experience something that traumatic, that sometimes you are going to have to pull them from that world on the basis of the connection that you have made and how significant that connection is.
Great. It's a different way of working, isn't it?
Different than I learned.
So we then have in our first movement is the search. We have all sorts of reflexive content that reflects who knows what in that search. The next kind of content that I want to talk about is the non-human. Non-human contact has been talked about a lot in the psychoanalytic literature. The first major article, the classic, was by Victor Tausk in 1919. There was a woman, a hospitalized woman, who had tried to explain to a number of doctors and people about this influencing machine. They kept making her do this and not letting her do that and forcing her to this way and so forth. This influencing machine kept making her do all these things. And in a moment of inspiration, he asked her to draw the machine. And it was her body. Her body was experienced as a machine, making her do things. You know? Now, an image that we might run into really in a number of different places. So that in this area of the non-human, Searles, in a book in 1960, Harold Searles, who has worked really a lifetime with very disturbed people, he has written about a whole book on the nature of the non-human environment. The totemistic, the mystical, the animistic, the animals, all of the things, and we begin to realize that our world is largely made up of non-human elements. But for most of us that develop through object relations, it's not the non-human that's important, it's the human element that's important. But for people who have not moved into human contact, the non-human environment provides very many of their symbols. And so one of the things that we can expect with people at the organizing level is the non-human. And let me say that a different way. Often in a case conference, someone will begin presenting something, and there'll be some material, and there'll be something non-human. And immediately I'll say, wait a minute, I think we're now looking at this person's organizing level. And people kind of look at me for a while, and then we begin to massage it back and forth, and we begin to realize, here's someone who ordinarily we expect to be functioning on a different level, but something has happened, and suddenly they're back on an organizing level. And the cue that made us realize that was that there was a major non-human element that appeared in the material. So it's almost as though the non-human influences are very important. Those of you who have studied the Rorschach test, you know there's a scoring category for inanimate movement being projected into the blots. We expect from young children all sorts of animals to be projected onto the blots. By the time children get 4, 5, 6, when they identify with humans, we expect human movement to be projected onto the blots. In ordinary circumstances, in people with ordinary object relations, we do not expect inanimate movement because we're projecting something of ourselves onto those blots. We are not inanimate. At first you think, well, couldn't you see a spinning top or swirling clouds or something like that? Well, you think you could. People generally don't. Some exceptions. Hyperactive children. They often see things moving. But the world moves around them all the time. And somebody's all the time hitting them, telling them to stop, do this, do that. So their world is constantly moving around them and impinging on them. The most fascinating study in this was done by a psychologist named Shalit, who was with the Israeli Navy. He had Rorschach protocols on the people that happened to be aboard his ship, and they were in the middle of a storm, a very dangerous storm. The ship was about to capsize, and he's dragging people off the decks, giving them Rorschach plots, full of little M's, full of little M's, confirming the general hunch that when we experience the world moving around us, we project then the fear of that, and it shows up in inanimate movement. On the blots, blood dripping, cloud swirling, all sorts of inanimate movement. It could be top spinning. It doesn't have to be negative content, but usually there's a fear involved with it. So then you're going to give us some examples of the inhuman.
Yes, you will have in your packet on page 9 a drawing by Mary for quite some time, and we still see vestiges of it. She still experiences the spirit world, harassing her, looking at her, laughing at her particularly. That's one of the big things, laughing at her, wanting her to die, always out trying to find a way to create a scenario where she will be destroyed. And on page 9, if you'll turn it the long way, you'll get a better sense of what she actually drew. And one day I asked her, because I was wondering if she could picture for me, you know, what sense she had of the spirit. And the dark black is at the top, and you'll see there's just two little tiny white dots. Can you see those? And that's really the spirit's eyes, and then the line coming down is just sort of the rays watching her, observing her, laughing at her. And so this is one thing that has been very much a part of her material. Also, she's talked about alien creatures that take over her brain. That has been there rather consistently in the past. For quite a period of time, a number of months, almost every session, we had bugs eating her brain. And that's why she could not think. That's why she could not process. We hear, I think it's been at least several months that we've heard about it, and consistently, not for quite some time. She does talk about, even currently, I just went away on 2 brief trips, and they were fairly back-to-back. I had a sister who was hospitalized with malignant brain tumor, and I needed to leave. And then this last week it was my sister came through fine, by the way. It was a pleasant time visiting a brother for his 60th birthday, a surprise, and our family was all together. But it was so close, and this is one of the difficult things with working with organizing people. They do not handle well your being away from them, the disconnection. And so up until last year, and I've been doing private counseling, private therapy for a good 15 years, I never took more than a 10-day break at one time because I was committed to being there for them. And even when I did that, I would make contact by phone and stay in touch at least one time throughout that 10-day period. But on my last 4-day holiday away, for Mary, she said things came alive at night. We have not seen that before, but I think it's recently. I think that's because we have seen a lot of structure developing for her. There is organization taking place, but that was just a little bit too much for her to have me gone 2 times in such close proximity.
Well, but I also thought that she read correctly how disturbed you were.
Yes.
I mean,
That's right.
we know that these people know our unconscious better than we do. Okay?
And she read my disturbance over my sister, and that became part of what she was experiencing. My struggle.
This was a suddenly diagnosed tumor that could produce death in days, and Joyce was extremely distressed, and I think that Mary knew that, and so I think that the magnitude of that distress made the nights come alive again for her.
And
We'd like to be able to keep secrets, but we can't.
Over time, I have chosen not to. And I have made, because I had cancer at the age of 35, breast cancer and lymph node, and it was not a good diagnosis, but you know, God in His grace, here I am. I have a good attitude, and I'm going to live life, and so I'm just fine. But she knows about that, and I have made a promise to her that should there be some diagnosis again of cancer, that I would tell her, and we would just have to work with it. I really have come to believe that it is better to work with truth, because one of the things periodically I, with Mary, go back and ask her to reflect on what has happened and what are the most significant elements, you know, in our building this connectedness. I started this when I did a case conference for Larry on symbols, and one of the things that she says consistently is trust. The only way I could connect with you is to trust you. And I said, no matter how difficult the issue is that I would need to discuss with you, I want you to know you can trust me. I will tell you. And so I told her about my sister. I told her what was going on. I didn't say I'm just going away, because I knew she would sense exactly what Larry referred to. There was no way she wasn't going to sense what I was experiencing. And I was not going to try to veil that.
Just amplifying that, I think when we have people with a whole array of object relations possibilities, then we have inhibitions, we have repressions, we have boundaries, and often there, the function of this kind of disclosure, say with neurotic people, there's no function, there's no purpose, it just distracts. But the further down we go, the developmental layer, the more the person is needing to feel connected with the therapist, the less inhibitions, the fewer boundaries there are between, and the more our mind is going to be read. So it's like at some point we can be dishonest, but all it does is direct the therapy. So at these lower levels, the question of disclosure is often, it's not the same as it is at upper levels of psychic development. Let's move on to the 4th point, which is the emphasis of the preoccupation on body parts, physical sensations, and bodily functioning. I was recently had the pleasure to read a dissertation that Sandra Jorgensen is working on the psychotic core, and she's taking a similar position that we are in terms of the treatability of the psychotic core. She had located in the Schreiber case of Freud's, where he says, no theory of psychotic process is trustworthy unless it covers hypochondriacal symptoms. So that throughout the history of psychosis, we've seen that body parts are prominent in the content or what's spoken. Now, it gets called hypochondriasis, whatever you want to call it, but I think that we begin to realize that experience comes into the body for all of us. It's registered in various bodily parts. If we've had object relations experiences, those body experiences gets translated into psyche, so we experience them in our mind as ideas, as images, as feelings. If we've not had the object relations preparation for that experience, perceptions come in and they stay at the level of the body. The somatic sensations register experience. Experiences are not represented yet in psyche. So with our organizing people, we will expect always talk about the body. And once again, saying it the other way, even with better developed people who then begin to focus on certain body parts, that may be our clue that at this moment we're talking about a taproot down to an organizing experience.
A portion of a session from Mary, in fact quite a recent session, and I'll just simply read. She said, "Does it make sense that I would feel safer in my world than this world?" She had just talked about the fact that although she's very aware of development and more comfort in this world and more comfort in connection, there's still a part of her that's back in that psychotic world. And so she was talking about that. Does it make sense that I would feel safer in my world than this world? And I said, yes, because you created what you thought you could control. And she said, yeah, even though it gets out of control, maybe with the spirits I get attention, though it is negative. You know something else that is happening at night? The body jerks seem like they are getting stronger, and basically I kind of curl up. Now, when she lays her head on my lap, oftentimes when she's getting in touch with that younger, what we're calling the core, that's in a steel egg is where we are right now with that core. She will get a body jerk. And so she was talking about at home at night, she's experiencing that more frequently. And we've talked about anticipating more of that as we really work with that core part of her. The body jerks seem like they're getting stronger, and basically I kind of curl up. It seems like tremendous pain, and I'm trying to defend myself from it, like something is hitting me in the gut, and I have this reflexive response. This flash goes through my body, but I do not know what it is yet. It is like a nightmare I refuse to look at. And I said, what do you think you might see that you do not want to see? And she said, I think something to do with Mother, but I do not know what. And then there was a big sigh, and she said, will you sit with me? And I always know when the words, will you sit with me, come, I know she's gotten in touch with the pain and the trauma of the not connecting with Mother. And then she became quite more solemn at that point. And I put the blanket on my lap, and she smiled, was able to make some connection with me, and she said, is that Mother's apron?
All right, we're going down the organizing path. We've got the searching. Right? We're now moving towards the moment of touch. In the book of Genesis, we read that God breathes life into Adam. Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel portrays the enlivenment as a matter of touch. In all the Madonna paintings throughout history that we have, we're aware that whatever it is that brings a soul to life, it has something to do with physical contact. Most Madonna paintings, we don't even see the mother looking at the baby. But the swaddling, holding, touching, caressing, however it is we become enlivened, it has to do with the concrete aspect of human touch. In a book that was published last year, edited by Catherine Barnard and Barry Brazelton, there's a large symposium that was sponsored by Johnson & Johnson Baby Products and the National Center for Clinical Infant Programs. International Universities Press put it out, and it's a collection of scholarly papers on touch, and the title is Touch, the Foundation of Human Experience. The consensus, we go back to Plato and Aristotle and follow all of the people through history who have thought about the nature of touch. The consensus is that the key element in touch is in the intent of the toucher. And we see that on the Sistine Chapel, that huge chariot of humanity, the whole logos, reaching out with intent to enliven Adam. Some of the nurses that reported studies in that symposium were reporting therapeutic touch, particularly studying levels of hemoglobin and various other blood chemistry things. The nurses have developed a whole set of ideas about therapeutic touch. In these studies, they're not actually touching, but they're moving the hands over the person's body, entire body, you know, a fraction of an inch from the surface. And in their training, they're trying to form viable concepts about the sense of heat, the sense of movement, but also in the toucher, a bit of meditation, a bit of centeredness before the procedure begins, and then 15-minute session of therapeutic touch. The dramatic results between of the various control groups in all the studies are absolutely incredible. The power of touch to heal. Then there's one of the more interesting control studies was a group of nurses who were trained in the mechanics, how to go about touching and so forth, but were not trained in the centering process and in what to feel for in terms of body heat in various places. They did exactly the same thing to the patients, but of course the effects were not found. So I think we're now on a brave new world about the importance of human touch. It's something we all know. We know how important it is to be touched. In our field, we're also aware of the dangers of touching, and we're also aware now more than ever of all of the faulty touching that's gone on in our civilization. It's gone on through incest, and it goes on among therapists and clients, touching that isn't. So one thing that might be said here as we try to all struggle with what the meaning of closeness and touch and the intention to reach out and find the other person there is that if there are therapists who have trouble distinguishing this form of human contact from other forms of touch, they probably shouldn't be doing this kind of work. There are other kinds of work. For therapists with histories of faulty kinds of touching, perhaps this isn't the best kind of work to be doing. Because if you can't tell the difference between incestual touch and touch for the purpose of enlivening a person, of contact, of development, of two people developing themselves together, then in some way or another, you should be doing some other kind of work, not working with people with organizing experience. We searched our minds for cases that we know, for therapists that we know, to see if we could think of a single instance where we felt that transformative work was going on without some form of physical touch, and we cannot find a single instance. Different therapists have different feelings about it. The way in which the touch goes, a token touch, two fingers touching, a light touch to the forehead, heavier kinds of touching. We're not talking about AA hugs and things like that. That's it. We're talking about meaningful touch. As we tried to think through, because we are aware that to advocate or to say that we don't think this work can be done without the concretization of human contact, that this is a rather risky thing to say at this point in our development of our profession, we began to realize that this is the only form of interpretation that's accessible to these people. And what is the interpretation of touch? As we begin to study the contact moment, we'll talk more about that, and we begin to develop the movement here, the interpretation is always, you have found me, you're in contact with me, based upon your history, you believe you must flee. You may flee into multiple selves, into delusions, into depressions, into hallucinations. You believe that you cannot stay, that human touch is impossible. There's a giant spider preventing you from staying in contact with me. But if you cannot stay in contact with me, you will never develop the bonding dance that permits human life as we know it. You can stay. You do not have to flee. How can we manage it? How can we stay in human contact so that your development can continue? And so it's not touch for reassurance. It's certainly not for gratification of either party. It's touch done at specific moments but always with the interpretive value. And the interpretation is always, you can stay. We can be with each other. You do not have to leave. And if the touch is done in that spirit, then we have an interpretation at a concrete level, because the words would never make it.
I find with Mary, we do hug at the end of every session. And I find myself doing that hugging rather consistently with individuals, either who are pervasively organizing or if we're working on the organizing pocket. What I also found, in addition to the touch that's in the hug, is that it needs to be a firm hug. That if it doesn't feel like it is something you are truly giving, you know, like a good handshake that feels like you've really extended yourself in the handshake, rather than this kind that says, well, you know, I don't know if I really want to do this or not. The intent is important. And the intent is felt in the firmness of that hug. And when that firmness deviates, she picks it up immediately. And she'll say, I want a bear hug. And that's how she handles it. Someone gave me it's a cute little poem, but or a saying about hugging that I think is apropos, except we don't want to hear it from the ooey gooey aspect, more the healing that can come in a touch. And it was distributed by Anaheim Memorial Hospital. Hugging is healthy. It helps the body's immunity system. It keeps you healthier. It cures depression. It reduces stress. It induces sleep. It's invigorating. It's rejuvenating. It has no unpleasant side effects, and hugging is nothing less than a miracle drug. Hugging is all natural. It is organic, naturally sweet, no pesticides, no preservatives, no artificial ingredients, and 100% wholesome. It can be, should be. Hugging is practically perfect. There are no movable parts, no batteries to wear out, no periodic checkups, low energy consumption, high energy yield, inflation-proof, non-fattening, no monthly payments, no insurance requirements, theft-proof, non-taxable, non-polluting, and of course, fully returnable. And as therapists, I have not felt comfortable telling people that I have hugged, but I have done it because I have seen the impact. I had a husband of a wife that I've been working with for quite some time who wanted to begin working with me, and I do that on occasion, and she wanted it as well. And he had seen a male therapist that I had referred him to, and when we first saw each other, he said, you know, so-and-so went on vacation, and he talked about whether I would experience anxiety separation, or separation anxiety, pardon me. And he looked at me and he said, he hasn't even shaken my hand yet. And I thought, interesting. You know, no touch. How am I going to experience anxiety over leaving you if we haven't connected? And his response told me something, because I believe it came from an organizing pocket. Because we can touch in other ways. You know, you can get the sense of connection in ways other than actual touch. But for him, you know, they hadn't even shaken hands yet. Let alone be connected enough for him to experience anxiety.
So that if we realize that psychotic organizing conditions basically result from the failure of contact, the failure of movement into the bonding situation, then we begin to realize that the way out of that condition is through a new kind of bond. Searles was the first one to suggest that the way out of it is by the formation of a therapeutic symbiosis. That the real person of the therapist has to be felt as a real live human being who's there, wanting to connect, wishing to be with that person, and forming a symbiosis based upon the personality of the therapist and the personality of the client. A symbiosis is a totally different metaphor for a therapeutic relationship than the ones that we would have when we're dealing with higher developed forms of psyche. So the contact at this very basic level, we're aware, cannot be done in abstract ways. It has to be done in concrete ways. And of course, Joyce has talked about her own way of doing it. I've worked with many therapists who have various other ways. My own particular way, when such a thing is necessary, I generally am working with my hand in some way or another, where there's two hands that are clasping or holding or touching or gently touching or something, because there's a great deal that can happen with a hand in terms of the motivation to be together and the caring that we stay with each other. So everyone has their own way of working with contact. But what's key in it is the motivation of the toucher, the timing, the quality of the touch, and as I said, those who can't distinguish those things needn't be doing this work.
I want to say that I personally believe if we're going to do the work for the primitive organizing person with a primitive organizing state, to bring them to the point of offering ourselves without completing it with touch, in my opinion, is oftentimes cruel. I can't think of anyone more vulnerable, more at the point of either integration or disintegration, than a person where you're talking about that connecting factor, that bonding issue with mother, and you talk about it. Can you imagine a mother hovering over a child and talking about bonding and not picking it up? And I think it's cruel when we do interpretations or therapy and you bring them to that point and then you say, I'm sorry, but we cannot touch. Now that may be my thing, but the longer that I practice, the more cruel I think that is. And if I feel I cannot touch, if I cannot do it in the right, with the right intent, then I ought not to be doing this work. Don't invite them to come close and then push them away. They've already had that.
Heinz Kohut, in his deathbed legacy to us, some of you may have been up at Berkeley on that magical day. He knew he was dying. He stayed alive to come to that conference. It was very moving to be present for it. And he told a story that had happened 15 years earlier. And it's kind of a commentary on our field that until he was ready to die, he couldn't tell it to anybody. The people who in the group around him wanted this particular part removed from the videotape. Marion Solomon wanted it in and finally went to Mrs. Kohut, who permitted it to stay in. He told the story of a very disturbed woman who, when she came in, laid on his couch, felt that nails were being driven into the coffin that she was lying in. He was very worried that he was going to lose her. She was in pain and agony, obviously a very disturbed woman. And he said, would it help if you held my fingers a little bit? And he extended his hand over the couch and held her. He says, a dubious maneuver. I'm not recommending it to anyone, but I didn't know what else to do. He felt that it was an important thing, that it was important, and that he did do it. And he worked many more years with that woman. And so I think that here, certainly one of the geniuses of our field was at a particular critical moment with a person in which he knew that he had to extend his hand, and it got them through a very difficult moment, he said.
Larry and I presented our material at CGI, and in that class there was a young man who was working with a woman that, by everything I could tell, was in an organizing state. And she obviously wanted to touch him, but was afraid to ask. And what she creatively did to make connection with him was to bring in a piece of string about 4 inches long and ask if she could tie one end to her finger and tie the other end to his finger. And I tell you, I wanted to cry. I thought, is that what we must do to make connection? We couldn't reach out and touch. But he, like most of us, were taught not to, and I don't in any way minimize how careful we must be Not at all. If we had time, I'd talk about Patrick Casement, because he has written an article on a woman who needed him to touch her hand, and he first seemed to offer it and then withdrew it, and she almost went into a psychotic break and almost aborted therapy, but they were able to work it out. And my sense was in the article, and of course I wasn't there to hear what was going on or to talk to the woman to see what her response would have been, but I got the sense that in his touch, he was overwhelmed by her pain, and that he considered touch because he was collapsing as a therapist.
Right.
No, we're not talking about touch because I don't know what else to do, I'm collapsing. I'm talking about touch where I'm not collapsing, but I know that that's what you need, that I'm reaching out in my organized state, not out of my disintegration. So that's really important also to keep in mind.
Touch in part of psychotherapy is widespread and common. It seems to me it is important that we start talking about it, because we do know that there's all kinds of faulty touch. Joyce only gave one kind. And so perhaps someone was saying we need to begin some seminars and so forth about study groups. What kind of touch? How do we feel about touch? When can we touch? And know that it's very important to do it in the service of our work. And when are we touching when we're not certain of what we're doing, or we're doing it for our own reasons? So I think it's going to be a very interesting topic to try to develop. Let's then move then to the experience of transformation. What we're saying in our metaphor, the child is reaching out. Touch has been made now for this part of the talk. Touch is there, and we're going to talk about the transformative possibilities of contact, whether it's literal touch or whether we're talking about two people have made contact. Did you want to start with something?
I just wanted to share with you a moment of contact. Yes, it is. This is a moment of contact for Mary. There was a day when I was needing to go to the restroom more often than usual, and I had to prepare some people for that fact, and I prepared Mary for it. So in her higher level development, she sent me this letter on toilet paper, and on the envelope she put "handle with care." And it's, "Dearest Joyce, as you know, I am concerned about your health and welfare. Therefore, to assist you on your runs to the potty room, I can't read that word. I thought you would appreciate this pocket-handy stationery. There is no need to write a thank you card for this thoughtful gesture. A nice hug will do. Oh, by the way, thanks for the odoriferous lemons. They're great. I knew she liked lemons, and we have a lemon tree. I do that kind of thing every once in a while for the same reason. I care and think of you. P.S. English translation available by appointment only." Signed by her. Those are the kinds of things that would never have happened 6 to 11 years ago.
So the failure to organize is result, we believe, of the failure of adequate contact, because the human mind organizes according to interpersonal experiences. When we go back to try to study contact failure, or to study the nature of the contact situation, we can't study it without contact. And so various forms of contact are required for that. And the entire study, I feel, with all of the so-called psychotic pictures, is going to be around the moment of contact. The moment of contact is sometimes very difficult to decipher. I think typically of a case conference. A therapist comes in to present someone. They're aware that this person isn't contacting, but they'll tell us how the hours go. And after a while, we begin to realize, this person is saying all sorts of things, but there's no contact. And I think if there's a therapist difficulty, the number one difficulty is noticing that the person is not in contact. People come into our room and begin talking, and we just assume that they are talking to us, and that they know that we're there, and that they believe that we know that they're there. And this is our delusion. And so as we follow these people and track them for periods of time, we begin to realize that the vast majority of the time, there is not personal contact in these hours. So what we begin to do as we start to track a case is to begin to say, but wait a minute, where is there for just an instant a sense? And it doesn't matter what. It could be about a baseball game. It could be about a sewing. It could be about anything. But around that, there's a little sense of aliveness. You and I are here together and we're doing something together that's important, or we're saying something to each other. Whatever those moments are, I'm always encouraging therapists to go after those moments, to try to expand them. It takes a while to learn how to isolate them. I think that's the #1 task, is how to begin isolating when there's the possibility of a contact moment. Then it takes a lot of time to begin trying to figure out how to go after that and try to lengthen it, how to call the person back. Typically, as the therapist begins to study this, they will watch the person approach, because we've now learned pretty well this person's style. They'll feel the moment of contact, and then they'll watch the disconnect and watch the person go away, because we're looking for that, because that's where the psychotic mother is. The one thing that's internalized from the pre-symbiotic state is that experience of withdrawing from something that is painful and frightening. So as they withdraw from the contact, we have at that moment transference. And the question is how to discern it. The best way to do is to call the person back. Wait a minute. You and I were just talking about blah, 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 blah. We were having a nice animated conversation. You seemed excited. You were glad to talk to me about that. And we were feeling good about it. And then suddenly, you went away. Can you tell me about that? And first of all, you'll get a blank stare. Okay? There won't be any sense of what's going on at all. But in very short order, I find the clients open their eyes wide because they realize no one has ever reached out to them and said, come back, stop, you're running away, and I want you here. We've got to find out what it is that keeps you running away from us being present here and now. One of the most interesting examples came in an advanced case conference. A wonderful therapist, very a man that many people might describe as warm, loving, almost a teddy bear kind of a person, but very good, say, in connecting with the symbiotic people because of a good empathy and a good sense of understanding. He was working with a very bright woman who had had years and years and years of therapy, but nonetheless, her organizing level had not been tapped. He brought the case in, and there were several interesting things that he described. The way his office was set up, it's as though his chair was here, there was the couch, and then the door out. She would come in and sit on the end of the couch near the door, sit at the edge of her seat, and talk. And as we began to look at those hours, what we began to discover was she would say something, and then the therapist would give a very warm, connecting response. She would turn her back. I mean, it was like literally turn her back on him. So as we began to coach him in this conference about how to begin working with it, he would stop it, call her back, ask what it was, and she became very interested in it. So in each case conference, week after week, we were excited because she was doing it and he was doing it. And then one day he comes into the conference and he says, you guys are not going to believe what happened this week. So he starts through the hour, and sure enough, she says something. He calls her back, and she turns to him and says, now, are we going to do this every session? He says, I didn't know what to say. I said, the answer is yes. This is what our sessions are about. Our sessions are about studying contact and studying the ways in which you are compelled to move away, because that moment of moving away spells out your own private, personal history. In a few comments from the psychoanalytic literature, the way Christopher Bolus has talked about this in a paper called The Transformational Object, he talks about how the way that the infant first knows mother is through the transformation of states. That is, it doesn't know mother as separate or as a being or a mother's face, but rather there's a tension state, mother does something, the state changes. And so the mother is first known by transformations. And Bolus points out that Freud unwittingly and forgivably acted out this transformational situation by the way that he created the psychoanalytic situation. He created the psychoanalytic situation as a quiet time whereby when people are needing transformation of states, it can occur. The person who's perhaps studied the transformation of states most clearly is the British analyst Wilfred Bion. Bion was interested in the question, why does one monkey think and the others do not? What is the nature of thought? Human thought. He has a lot of esoteric theories that are wonderful but difficult to comprehend, but for our purposes here today, the simplification is, he talked first of all about the basic foundation of experience, sensation. He called sensations beta elements. The baby has beta elements and is responding, shifting, moving, struggling, doing something. Mother sees the action, the activity, and because of her thought system that was passed to her by her mother and her mother and her mother, and by the whole human race that believes about empathy and that believes that babies need this and babies need, she brings thought to it and she does something and changes the baby's state. Through repeated experiences of changing, of the mother's thought changing the baby's state, almost by classical conditioning, we have the baby then coming to anticipate and the baby taking over the mother's thought system. So that the thought system comes from interacting with members who are already initiated in the thought system. If the mother is not there to think for the baby, or if her thinking is faulty or erratic, or if it's around her needs rather than the baby's needs, the thought system will not be passed on comfortably to the baby, to the next generation. If we begin having the contact moment and it's taking, contact is being made, transformations are occurring, we then begin to move into what Margaret Mahler has defined the mutual cueing system of the symbiosis. I call it the bonding dance, the mommy and me pattern. Now, I'd like to remind you that the symbiosis is not blissful. If you look and you figure that the symbiotic period is between 4 and 24 months, I mean, that's a huge range of development. And in the middle of that, yes, there are blissful moments, but there are plenty of other moments, plenty of other trying moments, plenty of moments in which mother can barely stand to deal with this baby anymore, and baby can barely stand to deal with mother anymore. So the dance, the bonding dance is done based upon two natures, the baby's nature and the mother's nature. The mother brings thought with her nature, but what actually happens, kind of with a knee-jerk reflexive pattern, that's the way the dance gets done. These dances are regularly redone with us in therapy. So when the dance is established, we're not talking about organizing anymore. We're talking about symbiotic organization. We're talking about a borderline group of people. So if the person gets that far, there's a good sense of bonding, a good dance, and the way that they come into therapy with us is needing that same dance done again so that they can come back to mother. That's a topic for another day. In fact, we have a videotape of that. It's in my Interpreting the Countertransference tape, I do take up the question of the bonding and how in our countertransference reactions we are given the infant place of our client. And we must speak the countertransference in order to speak the infant self because the infant has never been able to speak before. And so that the way that the replicating transference is interpreted, the symbiotic dance, the bonding dance is interpreted, is by using the tool of countertransference in a very creative way. So for now, we're just going to say, if everything goes well, we'll move into a bonding experience. A few other elements of that, because it's not as though we have people that are just organizing or just borderline. We've got many people that have some symbiotic experience and some organizing experience, which is why we need to have a listening perspective for each, because we listen and respond in different ways. Melanie Klein's notion of projective identification is very important. Jim Grotstein has expressed a lot of different ideas about this. He calls it experiments in imaginative conjuring. If you can imagine it, it's real. And so the process of projective identification is imagining things projecting whatever it is that's in here onto the outside world, seeing it, taking it as reality, and taking it back in and introjecting it. So with Melanie Klein's notion of projective identification, we have images from inside the baby being projected onto or into the mother other, and if the mother other is able to absorb them and take them, rather, particularly if they're angry ones, rather than to feed them back to the child, she can detoxify a lot of the child's anger. But again, to talk of projective identification is a topic for another day. In the next step, the movement towards transitional activities, the person here who initiated our thinking is Donald Winnicott, with his wonderful 1953 paper on transitional objects and transitional phenomena. This is teddy bear talk, and a number of you have been present for my talks on the work of Winnicott. The first not me possession, the first object that the child recognizes as not me, has a transitional quality. It stands for something. It stands for mother. It stands for mother's body. Now we know earlier on, and particularly we can see it with autistic children, there are other objects that precede the transitional object. They're part of my body. Little children, the autistic children carry around these objects. You can't tamper with that object, because if you do, you're tampering with the child's body. It's close to that with the teddy bear. We do have to be careful with teddy bears, but we can often negotiate with teddy bears a bit, because teddy bears are alive. Teddy bears are under my control. Teddy bears do what I say, unlike my mother. And so the first symbol formation really takes off at the point of the transition, in which mother is now known as a real person. There's some individuation from mother, there's some separateness from mother, and there's now a symbol to represent mother when she isn't behaving right or isn't present. Many times in therapy, when we go on vacations, it's very important to try to provide people with transitional objects, talisman of various sorts, photos, recordings, whatever, in order to sort of bridge that gap, so that the transitional object represents the other in the other's absence.
I have had the experience with Mary that I've not had with any other person on the organizational level in reference to the transitional object. Typically, I look at that object as representing me. They can take it home. You know, Mary and I went out and she got we got a stuffed rabbit together, and she called it Cuddles, and you know, that was a transitional object. But the first object that she took from my office, that she asked me for eventually, and this is several years ago, she asked for a paper clip that I had been, I guess, playing with in the process of therapy. And my sense was that the paper clip was not a transitional object like the rabbit is now, but rather I felt in the beginning that paper clip was me, which I see as sort of the very primitive transitional object. I don't know if that's an appropriate way to talk about it, but I never quite had that experience with anyone else, but it felt very much like that paper clip was me. And subsequently, it's felt much more like it's a representation of me.
The next area I want to move to, we're still assuming that the connection has been made, the bonding dance is occurring. There's one other thing that I think is important for us to talk about, and that's the area of primary identification. Wonderful paper by Alice Bolland in 1943 on identification. And here's her argument. It's a brilliant one, and you'll be able to use it if you get it. If you don't get it, call my office and I'll send you a letter I wrote to Bob Hilton explaining it. Okay? Primary identity arises from trauma. That is, so long as the environment is compatible, so long as there's no cause for thought, no cause for frustration, life goes on. There's no impingement in the sense of going on being. The overindulged baby doesn't develop. Okay? However, identity is based upon encounters with the non-cooperative, with the non-compatible, and with frustrating environmental features. Because at this level, all experience is body experience, The primary identity is formed on the basis of mimicry, gross body mimicry, a capability in all the primates and in various ways in pre-primate species, capability of mimicking. And so the environment provides a picture, and the picture is immediately reproduced inside the body. We watch mothers and babies do this all the time. They play with each other's smiles and mouths and eyes, and they get all sorts of giggling and laughter by being in each other's body, by imitating each other, by feeling at one with the other person. I was listening to an hour, Frances Tustin reported in the London conference recently, and as she had to tell little Peter goodbye, he moved, she was sitting on the couch with her arms folded, and he moved and sat exactly like her and moved his arms exactly like her and postured exactly like her. And her interpretation was, if you're just like me, then we won't have to be separate. Right? So it was the trauma of separating that produced the gross body mimicry. The difficulty with this kind of imitation, though it's a primary mode of thought, if everything goes well, other modes of thought will replace it. Although we still are very well, we can look around the room at all the ways we imitate the people around us in our clothes, our dress, our posture, and so forth. So mimicry is always a part of us, but we also develop other things. But the mimicked other then becomes a part of our own body. And so when we study symbiotic people, we're very well aware that so much of what they are bringing is that they're bringing their mothers and doing to us what was done to them. They are relating to us in a way their mothers once related to them. Not in the specifics of the behavior, but in the dynamic aspects of the emotionality. So that primary identity is something that we're very accustomed to seeing. The next area that I want to move to then is your favorite topic, disruptions in the personality of the analyst. Right? Annie Catan, who studied the therapeutic nursery school a great deal, when she was studying mothers in relationship to their nursery school kids, she began to become aware that the mother that can't regress to the level of the kid can't tune in. She didn't like the word regression, though, because it had sort of a pejorative context, so she called it ego flexibility. But she's aware that empathy, if you're going to empathize with a 2-year-old, you have to be a 2-year-old yourself. If you're not the screaming witch mother, you're not tuned in to where this little fight is about. So what this means is that if we're going to tune in to a lot of the very early experiences that people have to tell us, we're going to have to be prepared to empathize in like kind, which we're not necessarily prepared to do. I mean, how many years did we go to school to learn to be dignified, mature adults, you know, and sophisticated therapists? And yet, in order to be in touch with some of these very early mind-body states, we have to be prepared to be much looser, much freer, much more playful in this regard. And Winnicott has emphasized the aspect of play in psychotherapy and how important it is for two people to be able to play, because in playing you mimic one another, you play with each other, you laugh, you do various things, but it's a different form of empathy than sitting behind a couch and saying, uh-huh. It's a different form.
On one occasion, in a session where it was particularly evident that Mary was playful, that part of her was free, I just touched her on her nose like this near the end of the session, and she giggled and giggled. Now that's part of the ritual. I can tell before she leaves the office, she typically, there's a little gleam in her eye when she wants me to do that. And I'll do that, and she'll giggle, and then she'll turn to me and she says, "You're crazy."
Coet felt that a major thing that we have to face in ourselves with a lot of pre-Oedipal reactions is narcissistic injury. That we have a need for self-objects, we have a need for narcissistic supplies, and I think with so many people, the things that they have to tell us are so disruptive that our own narcissistic needs are not being met adequately. And it's easy to say, well, we should be able to give them up, but we can't. They're a valid part of who we are. And so frequently we experience major disruptions in our functioning because our own sense of narcissism is not being adequately taken care of. And so we go to consultants, we go to study groups, we have a variety of ways of trying to regroup and see if we can't get our narcissistic energy back into good shape. Giovacchini, in his numerous books on what he calls primitive mental states, talks about all sorts of disruptions that he has experienced when working with these states in his personality functioning. And Harold Searles, of course, has talked about it particularly on a body level. He'll say, today my liver was hurting, or whatever. And so we're going to expect that kind of disruption. I touched this morning on the kinds of countertransference that I think are expectable. I don't have time today to talk about the whole range of countertransference, but we know that the main kind of countertransference that's been talked about from Freud on is countertransference that's an impediment to the therapy work. That is, if we're talking about neurosis and the therapist begin having strong emotional reactions, the chances are it doesn't necessarily belong in the therapeutic interaction. Kohut talked about a variety of kinds of countertransference to narcissistic states that are very different from that. I've talked extensively about the crucial importance of trying to understand countertransference with symbiotic states so as to be able to use them as a tool. But at this level, we see a whole different set of kinds of countertransference reactions. And I think I said first, the first one is the denial of the patient's humanity. The patient is untreatable, lock them up, give them drugs. Now, neither Joyce nor I are opposed to hospitals or drugs. We both use them as a part of our therapy. But it's as though we're very well aware that if that is the only way we're going to go with these people, then basically what we're saying is you're not treatable, I can't treat you, and that's it. So there's one kind of countertransference reaction. The second one is that we're dealing with primitive energies: aggression, rage, hatred, love, sexuality, name all of the primitive instinctual energies that we have, and we're asking, when we ask for contact, we reach out and pull the person towards us and say, come back here. We're asking for all of that to be right here and now, and we've got to be prepared to endure it. And it's often very difficult and very trying and very disruptive to us to have to work through these very intense experiences. The third form of countertransference, then, is the fear of encountering our own psychotic mother. That there were ways in which we were unresponded to, and when we're with people who are not responding to us, it revives in our own memory not being responded, and it revives this gigantic spider that says never go there again. And so we back off. We're afraid to reach out and say, come, stay in touch with me. We can do it. Because we're afraid the person's going to go away. And it was painful when we reached out and our mother didn't meet us. It was painful. And so we're afraid to do it again. And the fourth form, I told you, was out of empathy. That is, now I think this fourth form will make a little more sense to you, because I've talked quite a bit, and Joyce has, about the contact moment, and about how by massaging that contact moment, constantly pulling the person back, working it, we're not merely trying to make contact, we're trying to study, analyze, understand the disconnect. It's the disconnect where the action is. But we can't study the disconnect until we have the connect. So the reason that we're trying to work on the connection, the reaching out, the contact and touch, is because it's never possible for human beings to stay in contact with each other for very long. Have a conversation with your significant other, and how long does it last? Right? We're aware that we're always moving, we're leaving, we're walking away. So sustained contact, as I told you earlier, is the backdrop against which we can study the psychotic mother that appears in various ways to move the person away. I like to tell this one story. When we first saw this, we had a study group just before Listening Perspectives was written. I had to do one chapter on psychosis, and I didn't know what to do. And that last year, I pulled together a group of about a dozen people, all of whom were working with organizing people. We met for a brown bag lunch. We had one particular woman that we were going to follow process notes on for the year, but everybody else had information. And we said, what sense can we make of this organizing experience? So we'd been following this woman for some time. The woman, the speaker, had come not long ago from another state where she'd been involved in an esoteric yoga sect. And she had come into the area, and the contact with her therapist had been made through a yoga center. The therapist also happened to be a yoga instructor. So the contact had been there, and then the woman had asked for therapy with her. As we began to listen to all of these very strange things, they were strange things. Fortunately, we had a yoga instructor in the room who could say to us, "This isn't yoga, this is crazy." So we listened to this. Then this woman was running all over the streets, hallucinating all the time. She refused drugs. She wouldn't go to a psychiatrist. These days, we're in question that. We almost can't risk treating anybody without making certain that they're under medical care. In those days, our liability was not quite what it is today. So the woman didn't want to take medication, didn't want to see a psychiatrist, and she was not forced into that. The therapist also knew some acupressure, and the woman knew that, and so there had been a bit of touching and acupressure was involved, but as we watched that, the therapist didn't feel that this touching was good. It was as though the woman would want it, but she didn't seem to respond well to it, and it wasn't quite clear what. So on the day in question, the therapist brings in the notes, and she starts off by saying, the patient says, "I want a treatment today," meaning acupressure. And there was, they had a table in the room for it and all that. So the therapist reminded her of the previous conversations that we're not quite sure. Let's talk about it a bit and see where, and maybe later, but let's see where it is. And it was a very warm, empathic contact, holding the woman, in, metaphorically in this case, holding her, letting her know that it was a good request, we needed to understand it more, and so forth and so on. And at that moment, the heavens opened up, the clouds billowed high with gold around them. From the throne of God, a jeweled sword descends and lays apostolically on the head of the therapist, dubbing the therapist as the right therapist for me. And the therapist went on, and pretty soon somebody says, "Wait a minute, let's go back to that." The hallucination broke the contact. And at that moment, we saw where we were headed. And it doesn't matter what the complaint is that we might call psychotic, what the symptom is. At that moment, contact is being broken. And at that moment, we want to pull the person back and discover what it was. Now, since we didn't know how to study that in those days, we didn't have a way to call the woman back and to try to follow it through. That seemed to me to be a crucial moment in my own development of thinking about the importance of the contact moment and the variety of ways in which people achieve it. You see, because it didn't look that way. It looked like it was a nice response, saying basically, "Thank you for being such a nice therapist, and you're really wonderful, and I really belong here, and isn't this lovely?" And that wasn't what it was at all. So as you begin to study people at this earlier level, you begin to find the ways in which people break contact are very subtle and very hard to locate. Once you're onto them, it's just clear, and then you can track it.
One of the ways that Mary breaks contact that I've not experienced with anyone else so far is that she tells me it's not me. I'm not there. And I'll just read a couple lines from a session. And that often happens if she thinks I'm angry with her, which she projects into me a lot. "I get the feeling you're mad at me tonight." And I said, "No, but what makes you feel like that?" "You do not seem like Joyce tonight. You look different. I need Joyce to sit with me tonight." I said, "It seems like I am not Joyce when you are struggling with something. Is that the way it has been in the past?" She asked me. I said, "Yes, I think so. I do not know why I would do that when I need to be close. I really needed Joyce to sit with me tonight." And I mean, we're right there, but she's insisting that I am not Joyce. And I have watched this now. I mean, I was very puzzled about it for a long time, but now I believe this is precisely what it is. For some reason, maybe it's because she is projecting anger into me and therefore needing to distance herself, but these two come in tandem quite often.
Moving on to the contact failure, there's a lot of things that could be said about contact failure, but in order to relate some of the thinking today to maybe some of our traditional training, I want to quickly go over what I call the mythic themes of the organizing experience. Depression. Let's think for a minute about depression. Biological or psychological understimulation, failure of certain kinds of stimulation, contact, could lead then to an apparent depletion of energy and motivation and a failure of the symbiotic provision to arouse and to stimulate the affects and to regulate the level of energy and activity, would be a way to formulate that. Mania, we have biological or psychological overstimulation of the affective life, a failure of the symbiotic provision to contain perennially unregulated, elevated affects. We notice babies come into the world with highs and lows that are quite unregulated. Through the symbiosis, slowly, mother brings the highs down and the lows up until we're within the realm of conventional affective stimulation. In paranoia, we might say a failure of the infant to environment contact, for whatever reason, a failure that might, of the contact that might be reassuring and stimulate satisfaction, safety, and trust. Possibly experiences of traumatic intrusiveness felt as aggression, molest, sadism, intrusion, conspiracy, or general failure of the world to provide a stimulating, satisfying place. In schizophrenia, we find that the way in which the mother-child relate is an unconventional way so that conventional thought systems don't have an opportunity to evolve. In autism, we have a general withdrawal from stimulation, which is not found to be satisfying. In schizoid, we have the same sort of thing, but perhaps not the same encapsulation that we have with autism. And in dissociation, we have, in the face of overwhelming stimulation, the person dissociates his or her thinking and feeling self from the immediately stimulating relatedness situation. The person may then be quite clear on what is required in the relatedness situation, but be completely cut off from personal experiencing of the interaction that's demanded. Milder forms of dissociation are seen as sleepwalking, sleep-talking, amnesia, and fugue. And of course, the more extreme form shows up in a lot of ways, particularly multiple personality. Let's take up the question then of symbols in the organizing experience, because I know as you sit with organizing people, you hear all sorts of intriguing and interesting symbols, symbols that are usually somewhat unbelievable. Organizing experiences are represented by a whole array of strange, bizarre, puzzling, idiosyncratic symbols. But what we've discovered over time is that whatever efforts we make to decode these symbols fail. These symbols that we see at this level do not work the way other symbols do, and the reason is the organizing symbols do not arise in experience like other kinds of symbols. That is, we talked a bit ago about the transitional object. By the time we have good object relations, we have then the capacity to substitute one thing for another. When we haven't had the bonding experience, the capacity for substitution, metaphor, metonymy, displacement, condensation, is simply not operative. So all of the symbols that we hear are not symbols in the ordinary sense, and it's a mistake to understand them. Freud and Jung, to mention only two, spent a great deal of time demonstrating to us how individual experience can be expressed in communal symbols. We have archetypes and symbols and language that we share. And our individual experience can be expressed or repressed using these symbols. So both expression and repression are accomplished by means of symbols, symbols that are substitutions. When the object-relation situation has not occurred, such that symbols can be used in that way, we have to begin to think of them in a different vein. Going slightly down from the Oedipus picture, Kohut talked about self-state experiences. In some comments that he made about self-state dreams, he talked about the symbols in self-state dreams are used to represent the state of the self in relationship to the self-object, so that the symbols are used to represent a self-to-self object resonance, or the failure of it and the fragmentation that results. So at the level of the 3-year-old, who certainly has a capability for using substitution, still we see representations being used primarily rather than expressions and repressions. By the time we move down into the symbiotic level, we begin to see that all manner of self and other representations are being expressed in dreams. Stollerow and Atwood, in a wonderful paper on dreams, took up symbols at the pre-Oedipal levels, particularly at the symbiotic and the border level. Their view was that a symbolic expression stands for a relationship that is experienced with its affects. That is, the symbol represents a relationship, a particular pattern or configuration of self and other experience. So that so many of the dreams we have that come from our so-called borderline people are direct representations of what's going on between the two of us, and it's not too hard to see that they're representations. When we move to the pre-bonding level with organizing, the pre-relationship level, symbols cannot be used to substitute. They cannot be used to express object-relation situations because there are none. They cannot be used to stand for something that doesn't exist. They are not representations. They are not substitutes. They're rather an expression that the person is wanting to make, not knowing how to make it. The person reaches into the world of symbols or words, grabs onto something, and presses it into service to try to make sense. But it's not decodable as such. It may open a ballpark for us, it may point a direction, but it's not going to be decodable from the common language system because the understanding of the symbol did not arise in the common way. The symbol then remains not a symbol in the ordinary sense, but an expression. It expresses a certain kind of meaning, but here it's a very concrete meaning. We must begin, rather, if we're going to understand organizing experiences, by understanding the specific experience that the person is having with us or with others in the world. As we begin to understand the way the person experiences movement towards us, contact, whether frightening or available, and the fear, the movement away from it, if we begin to grasp that experience, then the symbols will begin to take on meaning for us. And only then. Because at that point, we will find out what the symbols mean because we will have understood the experience. Recapping. Ordinarily, our traditional way is to hear a symbol, realize it's from the common language system, that it has many meanings, so we decode until we get to the personal experience that's embedded in that. The organizing level, we cannot work that way. We have to work the reverse way. We have to, first of all, begin to understand the experience, and then, dripping blood, bugs on my brain, begin to make sense. It's a very different way of thinking about symbols.
A very common one that Mary experienced for some time was she would cut herself, and somebody had asked me earlier if she ever did any self-mutilation, and she did. She would take tabs from soda cans, and she would cut herself on the wrist or arm just enough to draw blood, and that blood was baby. And I tried to decode that, to find out what that meant. But just as Larry has indicated, we could not decode it. And we came simply to see that it was an expression of the deep pain that she felt within, and the aloneness and the separation really from herself that she felt, as well as separation from others. But that was a symbol that she used for a very long time. The blood was baby, and that's how she would talk about it. And it didn't matter that that didn't make any logical sense.
Frances Tustin, in her work with autistic children, has particularly given good clinical examples of how she follows and follows, and she doesn't understand and doesn't understand, but she gets what the kid is saying, and then finally some symbol makes sense. The symbol that she has helped us understand is the symbol of the black hole. The black hole is where Mother once was. The black hole that one is terrified of falling into is the fear of falling into relationship, the fear of falling into relatedness. The little boy that showed it to her finally said there was a black hole with a nasty prick. He felt if he related, he would be hurt. The last aspect of this whole organizing path that we want to talk about, when the person has reached out, they felt frightened, they pull back. We see then an idiosyncratic use of symbols. We see the inability to reach out and touch. We see all of these so-called psychotic symptoms, the mythic themes, these that are substitutes for the object relations development, but we also see a mimical self. And we've hinted at that all day long. I was studying what sort of formation can we talk about. Winnicott, you know, has given us the term false self. False self, we all have a false self. Winnicott's notion was the child is born into the world with a basic instinctual life, all sorts of instincts, life instincts. And as the baby begins to reach out to the mother, in many ways the mother is able to receive the instinct and cause it to develop creatively. But there are many times in which this mother either does not understand or for her own needs or whatever, forces the baby to mold the instinctual life to the mother. So that the false self is based upon an ego development that molds to mother's way of being while relinquishing the child's own true self. At the organizing level, we don't even have that. When contact failure is there, there's no one to conform to. There's only people to imitate. Monkey see, monkey do. In Kosinski's Being There, we see Peter Sellers mimicking, monkeying, aping. You might think that people can't do well. My favorite organizing personality that I supervised for many years is a self-made billionaire. He was raised in a slum. His profile is regularly written up in Fortune magazine. He runs 12 mega corporations. His therapist spends 20 hours a week with him traveling all over the world. They have penthouses in various places where they do their work. Not 6 months old. When you stop to think about it, to succeed in business, in industry, and corporate life may not take a lot of object relations. Contrary-wise, I don't see many rich people here. Some of our most painful experiences are the experiences when we are able to relate to others and we feel grief, sadness, longing, yearning, so that people are quite able to move in our world and do very well, function very well and very highly in many regards, and yet still their object relations picture be at this level. And the answer to that, there may be some aspects of false self, conforming. Much of it is straight by imitation. You can go a long ways in this world by strictly imitating. Some of our most painful experiences are the experiences when we are able to relate to others and we feel grief, sadness, longing, yearning, so that people are quite able to move in our world and do very well, function very well and very highly in many regards, and yet still their object relations picture be at this level. And the answer to that, there may be some aspects of false self, conforming. Much of it is straight by imitation. You can go a long ways in this world by strictly imitating. So in order to cap this up, I have a thought, and then Joyce has one. Each one of these 16 points that we've gone through today has been an attempt to try to describe what people have shown us are their experiences left over from this earliest attempt to reach out and find mother. And as you begin to study, as you begin to think about this in your own relationships and in your therapy, you begin to see the contact moment as very poignant. You'll begin to find yourself withdrawing and suddenly say, wait a minute, and you'll watch what's going on, and you'll be able to hit a taproot of your own organizing experience. Or perhaps someone that you care about very deeply, you're relating to, and they're pulling away and say, wait a minute, come back. Someone was telling me the other night at dinner, after having been exposed to these ideas, what a difference this is making in his marriage. Because there were two therapists. Once they got onto this idea, they began to become aware, wait a minute, you know, we used to just get pissed, right? Because the other one wasn't doing it right. But when we began to become tracking the way in which we each one withdraw, and suddenly there was a whole new world of things to talk about, and a whole new way of understanding one another, and realizing that the organizing experience is something that we live every day of our lives. And it's only in exaggerated form in the people that we work with.
Our time is very limited in reference to looking at some treatment implications, so I'm not going to elaborate on them very much, but I do want to make a couple comments. One of the first things that comes to my mind is don't be fooled by social adaptability, or don't be fooled by intelligence, because it doesn't matter what color, creed, or level of intelligence, organizing pockets are there, or even pervasively. Another treatment implication is with these individuals, we will not be able to do the one time a week kind of therapy. It's going to require at least 2 to 3 times a week. And oftentimes there'll have to be some adaptability, like perhaps instead of meeting twice a week, it might be well to meet 4 times a week for a shorter period of time, because they need the concrete physical contact with you. And if you don't do that, what I have found happens is that then there are the phone contacts, because they're not able to tolerate. Once they begin to start reaching out, they want to be absolutely sure you're going to be there. And so frequency is very important. And I found with Mary that what she would do is oftentimes in between sessions, and I have seen her 2 to 3 times a week, she would come in just for a hug, or she would come in and sit in the waiting room just so that she could see me in between sessions. Although early that was very difficult, because that meant I was connecting with someone else. But she would do that at times when she just, needed to have some kind of contact with me. What I do when I get involved in phone conversations is I do try to put boundaries on that. For instance, we will try to make it consistent maybe for 10 minutes, and I have found that it works just fine, because the issue is not how long we talk or what we talk about. The issue is the contact. And so when you've made that, they're okay. Sometimes I've done that very early in the morning, especially when opening up some of the deep level pain, it was very hard for her to go to work. And so we would talk for about 5 minutes early in the morning, and then she was fine, was able to go off and have a good day and function quite well. So there's real variability that's going to happen when you're working with these people. And yes, you do get depleted of energy, and you do need times out. And at times I do say to Mary, I know that you need me, and I feel very badly that I have needs of my own, but I am needing a weekend away. There have been occasions where I have called when I have been away on a weekend. Sometimes I will have somebody else be on call so that I can, really be free to be totally at rest. Another thing that I think is really important, and that is if I begin to see that there is this organizing level, if I've not seen it early, and oftentimes this level, especially if it's a pocket, or I don't know if I can say minimally pervasive, that sounds contradictory, but where it's not full-blown, that you don't notice it, in the first few months of working with this individual. When you begin to see that organizing aspect, I think it is very important to take a look at whether you are going to be able to continue therapy with this person. We are going to be putting into our book a situation where a therapist had to stop in the process of therapy, and it did result in a suicide. Because when they do begin to reach out and make that contact, it is extremely traumatic for them. It is not easy to refer to someone else, and in this particular situation, the referral was done as well as any referral could possibly be done. But the person was yet not able to tolerate it and ended up taking his life. So we really need to think about it. This is long-term work, but it is of tremendous value. And I can remember the day that Mary said to me, I dreamed my whole life that someone would be able to be there for me and with me and care about me like you have. And it's finally happened, and I now know I am going to make it. And just a few weeks ago, she wrote this poem, and we close with this today. I came to see you, Joyce, in brokenness. You came to me in love and healing, yet with bittersweetness in my heart, for I feel steep pain. I am pain. I am agony. I am brokenness. I am tortured in mind and spirit, but you came to me with great compassion of heart and a song of love. Like an infant soothed by mother's presence, my pain began to melt. My heart flowing over with pain, I turned away. I could not. Yet I longed for the light of your eyes to express the tenderness of understanding, and they did. I knew then what I now know. I will be healed, underlined. A strong bond never could one break, a true connection never a lie, a deep engaging love never to ache alone again. The cold bonds of pathos is broken in its icy stillness. The warm glow of love is rekindled in my heart. Having been stripped of its light by the rape of innocence, it shall one day dance again.